So you'll be able to follow where we're at. We're going to do our very best to hold to those times tonight, just given the late start and the hope that we can get folks home tonight. So just give us a few more minutes for the rest of the seats of the committee to fill. We'll get going. Get going, so I appreciate your patience as we get started. I know I saw Jody. Has anybody seen Dan or heard from Dan Stapleton? Okay, great. Okay. We did that last time. We saw each other at Chambers and 104th, and somehow he was after me. He took a different route.
Hey, how are you? How are you? Good.
Was everybody able to get a copy of the agenda, or has anybody not received one? Okay. I know they're going to make a few more, so we've got those out there. Okay. In the interest of time, let's go ahead and get started, and we will catch Dan up as he gets into the meeting. My name is Jason McEldowney. I'm a city council member at large here in Commerce City, and I have been asked by council to help facilitate this committee of the citizens and members of council, along with, in its full configuration, members of the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission, the Colorado Oil and Gas Association, representation from the Rocky Mountain Arsenal National Wildlife Refuge. We have members from Be the Change. These are career experts in environmental science, EPA backgrounds, et cetera, who are here to help provide perspective in that regard. We have membership from Tri-County Health, 3 industry parties, including Halliburton, Anadarko, and Hillcorp, along with special counsel to Commerce City, Mr. Philip Barber. Tonight, the committee is being seated with our citizen membership, and we've brought some additional city staff to the table, in addition to our council membership. And the focus tonight was to help bring our council and citizen representation more closely together in an effort to get the overall committee effort back on the road. We felt it was an appropriate time to subdivide the discussions, and so tonight is our first of those formats. The agenda, which you've hopefully gotten a copy of, gives you a pretty good detail on how we look to move through the discussion tonight. We do have a time block that we protect at the backside of the meeting to allow for any citizen communication. And so we'll make sure that we stop promptly at that scheduled time, even if we're slightly off agenda, so that we can open it up to those questions. And then we'll seek to close out the agenda thereafter. Let's see, in addition to the agenda that folks received when they came in, we've also got a one-pager that was part of our original charter, just to help reinforce the charter of this committee, our timeline, the original timeline, I should say, and then the composition of our committee. With that, let me go ahead and give a quick recap of our council comments from our Monday night meeting. In effect, we had council members raise concern about the progress of this committee. Originally chartered for 4 weeks to try and come back with recommendations for council's consideration in an effort to update our land development code. That is essentially the regulations at a local level that govern what can happen on the ground inside of Commerce City. So those land development code rules, if you will, come into play when you're building a home, building a factory, laying a street, planning a neighborhood, all of those things. They also have bearing on activity like oil and gas, but only on the things that happen within reason above ground. And that's one of those big gray areas, if you will, in the overall discussion is what is the limit of what a locality can govern and enforce, and what is the limit of what the state can enforce. So we have a hefty task in front of us to sort through all of that information and work with, again, our external counsel who's looking at the very big picture to compare and contrast what the current Commerce City Land Development Code has within it and what other municipalities throughout Colorado, and for that matter, the country, have done that have proven to be successful in that they are defensible in court. Ultimately, we want to be able to get to a point where we have a laundry list, if you will, a menu of proposed modifications to that land development code. But that's not the only intended outcome of this committee is I should say, to make changes to the land development code. We also hope that by having the industry players at the table and the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission, that through those discussions we can achieve a memorandum of understanding on areas that are outside of those topics that we can govern locally that would provide us potentially additional provisions that don't neatly fall into our ability to regulate or govern. So that is a brief background of, again, sort of the committee charter. Again, council's concern Monday night was that we needed to get ourselves focused back on that outcome. I should just add that through the discussions that this committee has had, we've received agreement from industry 2 times now to honor a 30-day stand down or voluntary moratorium, if you will, on oil and gas, specifically new well development or fracturing of either existing wells or new wells in Commerce City. So I think a good outcome, at least to this point, of what we've been able to secure from a relationship perspective with having them at the table. Obviously, we want to get to a point where we have a clear set of those rules in place and we're able to then move forward. So council asked that we reaffirm tonight for the committee and for those in attendance the purpose of this committee. So if you notice in your agenda, we have under bullet item 2, council objectives for committee/charter. This was created by council on December 19. The purpose of the Oil and Gas Commission Land Use Committee is to promote dialogue among interested parties, study the impacts of and assess the risks of oil and gas development within the city, determine if and what changes to the city's land use development code are needed, and provide a written consensus recommendation to the City Council for consideration in their deliberations on Ordinance 1880. Ordinance 1880 is a ordinance that has passed on first reading, meaning it's pending second reading, and if voted on and passed in second reading would be enacted immediately. As it stands, that motion, or I should say that ordinance, has been continued for future discussion. It will come back up before council on the 27th of this month, and that ordinance, if passed on second reading, would enact a 6-month moratorium of all oil and gas activity in the community. But to be clear, it would only impact Commerce City proper. And so for anyone who's looked at a map of Commerce City from a land use perspective, particularly in our northern range, and for that matter throughout our city, we have many little pockets that are not in the city proper. For all intents and purposes, drive by them every day, they appear to be in the city, but they are technically in the control of the county. And so any rules that we might, as a council, put forward would not have any direct bearing on that. So again, part of our hope is that through these discussions within the MOU, or a possible MOU or memorandum of understanding, that we could potentially see agreement on how those activities that would occur in the county could be governed, if you will. Also, just to note, we wanted to reinforce the rules of the road that were established at the onset of this committee. The full charter document is available for the committee members in your folder. So again, we just ask that, we maintain decorum through these meetings. We are all here in the spirit of dialogue. Public input, as I mentioned in my earlier comments, is dedicated to the end of the session. We have, again, citizen representation, and let me just point out who we have on the committee here relative to our citizen representation. We have Tracy Snyder. Tracy was most recently a mayor pro tem here in Commerce City, lifelong resident of the community, and is here as a citizen representative in her current capacity. We have Dan Stapleton, resident in the Northern Range. Dan's a professional pilot and has been a great member of this committee as well. We have Jody Bacon. Jody has come in as a replacement for Mr. Michael Scanlon. Jody has also been a good and active member of the committee. To touch on our council member representation, we have Mr. Renee Bullock. Renee, can you put your hand up for me? And we have Mr. Steve Douglas as our two formal members of the committee, also sitting as a, I guess we could call it an ex officio capacity, is Mr. Jim Benson sitting here. And then tonight, from a staff perspective, we have Mr. Alan Colon, who's our emergency management coordinator for the city. So if anything really bad happens, Mr. Colon is in charge of helping to coordinate that. He also has control over planning for how to deal with those situations if and should they occur. I referenced Mr. Phil Barber earlier. Phil Barber is external counsel, oil and gas expertise, and is on retainer with the city to help lend his expertise to these discussions. Next to Mr. Barber is Mr. Greg Graham. Greg Graham is in our city attorney's office and has been aligned to this project to help lend additional support where it specifically relates to our current code and current ordinances. Mr. Kramer here at the end of the table is our planning manager. Chris Kramer has been with us in the city for some time and has charge over our planning department. So very hands-on with our land development code, our comprehensive plan, zoning activities, plan reviews, all of those things that come through our community. So Chris is here to help lend additional perspective, and he and his team have been working behind the scenes on an in-depth analysis of our current land development code and beginning the comparison against other municipalities and where they have taken their code with regard to oil and gas activity. So that's a little bit longer of a, and I should acknowledge, we have Ricky Teeter, another member of City Council, who's present here in the front row. So that's the folks at the table tonight. Again, the objectives, and with that, any questions from the committee to that point? Okay, great. So the first thing I wanted to do tonight, as the outline, the agenda outline suggests, is to go through an exercise where we try and define what each of us deem a success factor. It's been clear in some of our discussions that we have all of us, for that matter, have great passion and concern about this topic and want to see the very best for the community. And I'm concerned that we have talked past each other at times and want to find out how we can ensure that we're all being heard, that we're getting concerns documented, and that we're determining what of those items we can control through this discussion and what we need to either send back to council for consideration of approaching in a different way, or if it's an item that's out of our control, find that, put that on a list, and let's find a way to get that to the right place. So there may be an item, for example, I think there was a recent ruling in the State House this past week, a bill that wanted to set setbacks for certain oil and gas activity to 1,000 feet from homes, and it failed. Well, that's unfortunate. We, I think, all seem to agree that there should be some more robust setback. What should that be? If this committee can come up with a recommendation, and we find that it's not something that we feel our legal counsel suggests we can necessarily defend, well then maybe that's an item that we suggest council pass a resolution on that goes back to the State House that reinforces that that bill needs to be reconsidered. So we have many avenues. We need to find the right avenue for each of these things that surfaces, so that we can keep our time together focused on those things that will get the council requested objectives addressed. To help facilitate that exercise, I would like to have the committee members proper. Steve, if you can help me get those passed around. Steve's going to pass around a quick sheet here. If you can document 3 to 5 items that, if we could achieve, would equate to success from this committee. Once we get those, what I would like to do is have Ms. Snyder help get those on the pages behind me so that we can discuss what those submissions are and how they fit. Do they directly align with the objectives of the committee? Do they indirectly align with the objectives of committee, or do they not? And if not, what do we do about them in a formal way? Does that make sense? Any questions on that exercise? And Jim, you're welcome to fill that out. You're welcome to put that down. So we can get those filled out and back, we can get on with the next round of the exercise. While folks are filling that out, I did just want to touch on a couple things that staff was able to start to get some additional traction on in the background. Let me pull up my note.
Want them all up on one board, Jace?
We'll bring them back over here, and I'll talk them through, and we'll put them on one each board. So one of the questions that our committee members have asked for are current positions or leases held by the oil and gas community in our community. So let me translate what that request means. If we think of the map of Commerce City, where on that map, if we were to sort of divide it into 1 square mile plots, who has control of those plots? Who has existing wells? Who has planned wells? Who has rights that they haven't acted on yet? So that we can get a sense of who has interest and who's likely to take action in this community with regard to oil and gas development of those rights. So we asked staff for that back a few weeks back. They have gotten that task underway, but one of the interesting things about this exercise is the complexity of getting a very black and white picture of that. And so there are some documents that Mr. Kramer has begun to assemble, and we can make those available to the committee members to start to give you a sense of that. But that is an effort that is going to, frankly, continue. So when we get a little deeper in the agenda, we can come back to what that means and where we go from here. The second was answers to all the outstanding questions that have been submitted to date. We have received stacks of responses from the various committee areas of representation. Since our last meeting, staff has gone and recompiled all those responses into a much easier to review document. You received that, I believe, on email, and you've got a hard copy in your folder tonight. We'll be making that same document available on the city website so that you, as a citizen, can pull that down and review the questions that have been posed and the responses received to date. So for any question asked where we've received responses from multiple parties, those are all now neatly aligned. And then the other item that I touched on briefly that staff has begun to structure is that matrix, if you will, of Commerce City's land development code at present, and then those examples of areas where we have concern and how they align or don't align to our land development code, and again, what other communities have done in that regard, so that we can begin to use that as a point of reference in our structuring of our future obligations. All right, how are we doing on those success factors? If you're done, let me get those back and we'll get going on the next step. I'm going to try and pin this on, so let me know if this still works. Can you guys still hear me okay? All right, great. Okay. So, as I said, I think what we want to try and do is take these success factors and align them to whether or not they neatly align, I think I said directly, indirectly, or not at all, and then figure out for each how we carry those forward. Oh, Tracy, I was going to nominate you to...
You can do it. Go ahead.
Well, I have horrible handwriting. I'll get the started if you want to come pick up the rest of it here. Mm-hmm. So I don't know what. Okay. All right. So we've got three lists. One is directly relates to the council committee objectives, one that indirectly relates, and one that they don't relate. Our first one is to protect the health, safety, and public welfare of this community to the greatest extent possible. I think that is direct. Yeah, that sounds direct to me. Yep. Yep. The next item is air pollution assessment. And this is one that I will briefly defer to our two attorneys. I believe air, that was an air one, right? Air pollution assessment is an item that is kind of in the gray zone as to what extent we can influence that. So certainly relevant to the discussion, and I think we can put it on the directly list. Yeah, the next one as well.
Okay, go ahead.
Water assessment, and this includes considering the arsenal. Do we consider that also as direct from a rulemaking perspective, or is that indirect? Does that make sense? Well, if we look at the four prongs of our charter, do we deem that as an item that falls into our areas of recommendation? And I guess that could be land development code modification or MOU topic. That to me makes sense.
Yes. It would be something that you would want to consider regulating.
Right, and so, if we can have anybody who's speaking use the mic so that everyone in the audience can hear. What Mr. Barber said is we'd want to consider everything that we want to be able to regulate to some extent. The question will be to what extent we find that we can. Is that a fair restatement?
I would say the things that you have room to regulate, you should consider all of those. There are a few things probably that are off limits that would probably not be fruitful to go ahead and try to regulate those.
Okay, so we'll put it up here and we'll get to the finer points of what we can do there. I'm sorry, where did the rest? Oh.
What was that one, water?
Yeah. While we're waiting, I'll get it. The next one here says, if we can be sure that we are fully protecting the health, safety, and public welfare of the citizens of the community to the greatest extent possible, think we've got that, absolutely. Let's just put a check, a little tick mark to show that we've gotten it from 2. The next one is to negotiate a set of guidelines, rules, regs, et cetera, with industry, containing provisions that will protect our city and citizens. I think that's another tick mark on that first one. The next one is oil and gas surface owner horizontal drilling setbacks of 2 miles. Given that the state just disallowed 1,000 feet, I don't know that this is something that we can affect directly. So I'm going to suggest that we put this on the indirectly.
I would say that's not at all, because with a 1,000-mile failure on, 1,000
1,000 feet
failure on a setback, 2 miles is definitely going to be one of the things that surface rights don't trump subsurface rights.
Well, wasn't that in a committee in the House? That wasn't a rule that was overturned.
Yes.
It was a bill at the State House.
Yeah, but it didn't make it out of committee, but it wasn't.
Right.
Yeah,
If it
but-
doesn't make it out of committee, it isn't going to be.
Right, but it's not like it's a COGCC, they opposed it. And they,
Well, actually, they did.
no, what I mean is it wasn't proposed that they do that and they said, okay, we turn it down. It just never made it out of committee. And so it just takes 1 or 2 congressmen that don't like it to do that. That's all.
Right, so using this as an example, I think tied to my earlier comment, this may be one of those that we say as a committee, let's send this to council and ask council to pass a resolution that says we want to see some defined setback greater than the currently defined setback set by the state. Is that a fair?
But the state doesn't have anything beyond the 350, right?
They don't at present, and they just refused 1,000 feet, so
Well, yeah, 1 or 2 congressmen in that committee refused it. They
it never, given the political process, it never made it to a vote.
Right. But to say the state just allowed it is kind of
Okay,
disingenuous.
different choice of words.
Yeah.
So it didn't make it out of committee,
Right.
so it was dead on arrival. We need to consider how else that might get addressed. So it's certainly nothing that we can put in a defensible way in our land development code tomorrow and not be challenged on. So to me, that would fall into an indirect deal. It's certainly something we need to talk about how we contend with. Is that a fair?
Well, I agree 2 miles is a little much, but we certainly could ask for 1,000. I don't see why that would be unreasonable.
Okay, so let's do this. Has this for 2 different approaches. We need to put increased setbacks. We won't put a specific number on it here as a direct, because that's something we want to consider in our LDC and or an MOU with industry. And then indirectly is influencing state policy, right? So we can ask for something to go back to council that says, pass a resolution asking for greater setbacks. And there we're hitting it on 2 fronts. Is that a reasonable approach?
Yep.
The second point from this one was protect public from public health from oil, gas, and hydraulic fracturing. So I think that's another check mark on our top one. And the third was a 3-mile setback from the Rocky Mountain Arsenal. So my guess is that this is from the surface activity. We want a setback of 3 miles from that perimeter. Would we maybe, do an increased setback and another tick on that one? Let's see, back to Jody. The third is a third-party assessment of the Rocky Mountain Arsenal by a geologist or seismologist. This is something that would need to go to council to direct action on, because it would require, I would assume, funding either by council or agreement by the Army to fund that. Do we agree that that's an indirect, or I guess we could list it as a direct, but either way, we can't directly.
We can't, first of all, go on the Arsenal and.
We don't control it.
To do anything, we can ask the RVO, and they can hire somebody to do it, but we couldn't even hire somebody to go on the Arsenal and do an assessment of the Arsenal.
Okay, so let's consider that an indirect, and we would want to ask council to put forth a request to RVO to conduct said analysis. This is a third-party assessment of the Rocky Mountain Arsenal, and I would just insert, I think, regarding potential risks of oil and gas development to the arsenal, and have that conducted by a seismologist and a geologist.
Well, that doesn't necessarily mean you have to go on the property. That may just review records, and that's where the knowledge that we don't have is, I think, is what that's directing towards.
Yep. But I think either way, we won't solve it here. It's got to be, if we want council to spend dollars on it, we've got to put it in front of council and let them vote on where it goes and put the formal request. I would think that we could ask council to put a letter together that says, please formally request said analysis by the arsenal. Jim?
Jason, who would be a third party?
That's a good question.
Well, somebody that's not from the oil and gas industry, somebody that's not a government agency, somebody who's an independent,
Not from the RMA.
not from the RMA.
Okay.
Can you be more specific about
I think
that?
I think I get it. It's not the RMA, and anybody on the staff of the Army or the RMA.
What about Tri-County Health?
They don't have seismologists and geologists that I'm aware of.
Professor?
But
Well,
But you're looking for
we would potentially look at, for example, CSU. You know, maybe they have, they obviously have departments in environmental studies and seismology. That's something we can decide or talk about later. We want it independent from
Yeah.
the RMA. We want it independent from Tri-County. We want it independent from, obviously, the oil and gas. So
Okay.
somebody that's objective.
So we'd have to get the permission of the federal government through the arsenal, and then we'd have to hire somebody from like School of Mines, I think, a seismologist, whatever. Is that what we're
that's
talking
another
about?
fair program. Why don't we do this? If you can just make a sub note here that we ask staff to assess options. So we'll take this back formally and ask staff to look at to what extent can we do it independent of any involvement of the RMA, and to what extent do we need to engage the arsenal.
Yeah.
Right, but I think we just need to let staff figure out what the.
Is it just going to be an evaluation of
Maybe this would help.
quake?
Well, no, the concern behind that is the fact that we've got the millions of gallons of toxic chemicals there. We want to make sure, and we obviously, we don't know where that's gone when they put it in. So our big concern is, number one, we don't want to open up any more pathways as a result of oil and gas operations. We have to make sure, since we don't know where it's at.
Sure. So
Charlie,
Also, the earthquakes that occurred.
And we know what we heard from, I think I get the comment. I think the point is we got a really solid update from the arsenal. They didn't seem to have any concern. The request is to have a third party validate that if there's activity peripheral to the refuge, would it have any impact in their professional and independent opinion?
Right.
And I think that's fair. Let's see if we can get an answer to that question.
I know, Charlie Sharman said that the plumes had moved off to the northwest.
Well,
And
that's
he
the
gave us a
water.
map of those.
That's the water. That's not the toxins. That's the surface water. That's not.
They don't know where that is.
That's not the 12,000 foot toxins.
So I think we're clear on the task. We'll set that task off and let's see what we can get back. Study the impacts and assess risks of oil and gas dev within the city. Was there anything specific on that, or was this?
No, that's just the separate
Okay,
points.
I gotcha. Yep, and I think to an extent that's exactly what we're trying to do. Do you think, Jody? Do you think that's this one, or do you want it stated differently on this list?
I don't know. Why don't you go to the next one? Let me see
Okay.
if I've got that.
We want a legal analysis on banning hydraulic fracturing. So this is essentially the defensibility, I'm guessing, of a city's ability to ban fracking. Is that
Sure.
okay? I think it's fair. We need to determine the limit of what we can regulate and or recommend to council.
Okay, so it's going to be,
Legal analysis on banning fracking in CC.
like a total, on a total ban?
Right. Next is panel discussion.
Jason, can I ask for a point of clarification? So last week, we talked about fracking. Jody, you meaning basically anything related to oil and gas, and is that what this comment
Right.
is still asking?
Uh-huh.
Okay, thank you.
The next item was panel discussion on human health study in Garfield County. So this, I assume, would be to assemble appropriate experts that could speak to that
Right.
analysis, and then have that available for community members to participate in?
Right.
Okay. I would say that's probably indirect and something that we could get council's assistance in organizing a community meeting, that community panel.
Right, and someone who's well-versed in that study, who
Okay.
knows about it.
So, council, that's one we can certainly take back, I would think, as soon as Monday, and ask council to consider if staff would be open to helping to support such a...
That was 3 on there indirectly, right?
So we have a third one here that is panel discussion. So like panel/community meeting kind of a thing?
Yeah, kind of a
Okay.
two-tiered thing, actually. Take a look at it ourselves and then educate our community.
On
On it.
Garfield County Human Health Study. Oops, what did I do? The next one was real-time discussion on fracking where currently taking place. Can we get some more context on that one, so I'm sure we get
Yeah,
it?
that was what we had put in our PowerPoint, where we want to talk to communities where it's taken place. Before we would decide on course of action, we would want to talk to them and see what they did, what worked, what didn't work. Talk to people who lived, in the midst of it, who were living by wells and things. And
I've had the
have
same
a discussion.
interest to talk to electeds and in communities of that nature. And I've actually had a recommendation that we talk to the county commissioners in Weld County. It sounds like they've actually formed essentially working groups with citizens and industry to talk about in real time impacts on the community, what they're doing to maintain and monitor those. So it's one example of a community that's had intense activity, and it's happened over a course of years. And
Yeah,
so there are potentially other communities that we could
There's
pull
other
together.
communities, yeah. We have a couple in mind. I mean,
Okay.
if we wanted to, Weld wasn't one of them, but we have a couple in mind. So,
Okay, so this is really maybe another something like this. We're saying like a working discussion with those communities.
right, I think it would be,
liaisons from those communities.
right, I think it
citizens,
would be
electeds.
advantageous for us to have discussions with them and say, this is what we were thinking about. Did you do this? You didn't do that. What are your thoughts? And then also, again, it's all about the citizens, allow the citizens to hear those things as well. So it's always involving the community, bringing them in.
I think it's with other communities, and it would be including citizens, electeds, et cetera.
Absolutely.
Right?
We would want to hear from people. I'd want to hear from the person who lived by a well site.
Mm-hmm.
How has it gone? Were you happy about it? Were you not happy about it? Were the good things? What were the bad things?
Yep. Okay. A quality baseline, then during any, air quality baseline, then during any fracking. So I think this would be part of our recommendation. Is that your
Yeah, I mean,
suggestion?
do a baseline before there's any fracking, and then you can see what is any results of the fracking with water.
Your mic. Can you turn on that mic? Sorry. So I think what I heard you say is establish an air quality baseline, so conduct initial...
Water and air quality baselines before any fracking's done, and then you can see the effect of fracking
Establish baseline.
in times. So you actually know if there's any harm being done or potential harm.
Okay.
But you have to get your baselines
There's something to
now.
compare to later.
Right.
So we've added to the existing air pollution and water assessment the statement that we need to establish baseline.
Correct.
Okay. And you had water quality same as above, so we've got both of those. And then you've got impacts to roads and neighborhoods.
That's the roads and neighborhoods, because with the amount of truck traffic that is used for fracking, we've seen at times when they've dug out a gravel pit, the number of trucks that use the roads for a gravel pit, what they do to a road. So we would want to be able to repair our roads if they are damaged from the impacts of any fracking.
That makes sense. So we want to understand the potential impacts to roads, and I would guess the other piece of that is, and then
Neighborhoods.
provide recommendations on what we want to do to control or mitigate those impacts.
Right.
Okay.
Absolute control.
Okay. It's impacts to roads and neighborhoods, and then potential controls. We had another check for protect the health, safety, and public welfare of the citizens. I think we're all clearly aligned on that.
Understand impacts to roads and neighborhoods.
And potential, what did I say? Potential controls or ways to mitigate. Controls.
You had another one for the first one?
Yep.
That's 6 for that.
And I was busy talking and didn't fill out my list, but I would add to the list, given Mr. Cologne's presence, clearly understand the emergency, what we would call it, emergency preparedness or emergency planning factors around oil and gas activity in the city. I want to understand what we have in place and where we have gaps that we need to shore up. You can add another tick mark on the traffic and neighborhood impacts for me, this one here, and also on the very first one, and also on these, and on this one. Yeah, I think at a high level that's it. Does any other items come to mind that we didn't get up there?
You also called out the working discussions.
Yes, thank you. All right. So we have, right. I think the legal analysis on total ban of fracking is the sort of one borderline, right? We've heard from our own council, we heard at Mr. Benson's word meeting from the panelists present that you can't ban it outright. Current law says you can't ban it outright. We certainly need to understand what the rulemaking says there. But for the moment, let's leave it on this so that we can come away with a formal position, if that makes sense.
We're all together, I believe, that our attitude is that we want to go as far as we can and push the state preemption as far as we can so that anything that happens, we can enforce it. I think, doesn't everybody agree with that?
Well, I think,
I mean,
I know that's been your position, but we can't speak for the whole council. So I think,
I'm just talking about the position of this committee.
I gotcha. Yeah, and again, I think we have to be careful to each speak for the individual. I think, for example, my answer is I want to be as up to the limit of the line as we can. And to me, I don't see this exercise as sort of a one and done. I guess the most simple way to say it, like, I don't expect that we're going to get to a point and we call it done and we walk away from the subject. To me, I look at it as what are those things that we can solve for in the near term so that as and if activity starts to develop, we have at least those measures in place. And then there's an ongoing effort to look at how do we continue to control or regulate. Does that make sense?
Well, you know, hopefully the first effort is going to be to work out an agreement
Right.
with the industry people. And then I don't know how that's going to work out or how it's not going to work out. I hope it does work out and that we're going to be satisfied with the results. But if we're not, then we've got to look at changing the law.
Well, I think to that point, we've got to start to get the menu of those things that we'd like to make requests on. Steve, I think you had a question.
Yeah. Phil, what about doing a ban like Boulder did on new permits that are coming about, not the ones that are already there, the 2 wells that are already started, but new wells coming in? Can we do a 6 months moratorium ban on that just to try to find more understanding of how that's going to impact our city, because right now with the 1,000 feet setback pretty much not being accepted, there's still time out there. This is a big, huge issue, and It had to be done here, so we need to determine if that's a possibility.
Well, just to jump in and to speak to this, as I think we tried to set out at the top of the meeting, there was a 9-0 vote, of which you were part of on Monday night, that said, we're going to direct this committee to come back with recommendations on the modifications.
Right, but I'm asking him
I
on
understand.
Boulder, but,
But
okay.
it wasn't
My point
Boulder,
is,
it was Boulder
the
County.
6-month moratorium was not the directive of council on Monday night. It was to come away with recommendations in general. So we've asked for a legal analysis to occur on banning fracking in full. Do we want to supplement that by also including an analysis of a potential moratorium and the risks there?
Right, well, our moratorium is much different from Boulder's.
As it's written, it's much more aggressive.
Right,
That's
right, exactly. So I'm just saying, as far as adopting what Boulder has done on the new, permits coming up, not, we might have to put a different, amend what we have.
Okay. And I think the key is not to solve that question tonight, but to ask that potentially that be a part of the result we ask Phil to come back with.
Right.
For council. Okay. So we want legal analysis on total banning of fracking plus modified moratorium. Is that a way to put it? Like Boulder. Okay.
Now, can we hear?
Does that work?
Yeah, can we hear what he was going to say on that?
Yeah, I don't know, Phil, if you had a
have
point on
comment?
that, or if it's better to have it come back in the formal analysis to council.
Let me just say, for the benefit of the public here, lawyers have clients that, and my client that I take directions from is the city council. So if I tell the public at large what my opinion is to my client, then I've essentially waived what we call an attorney-client privilege. So I'm going to answer the question without giving a totally direct answer because my client hasn't said I can waive that privilege. So let me just address it this way. There have been moratorium imposed in a number of places. Longmont is in the third month of a 4-month moratorium. Boulder County just imposed a 6-month moratorium. You all are in the second month of what I'll call a voluntary moratorium. El Paso County had a moratorium for a period of time. I think Colorado Springs may still be in a moratorium situation. Arapahoe County had what I'll call a voluntary moratorium. And the best I can say is none of those moratorium, as far as I know, were ever challenged in court. That they basically were passed, they ran their course, and then something else happened. A number of the communities decided not to change their regulations or decided to modify them slightly. But I don't think there was, as far as I know, any legal challenge to those moratorium.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bill. Let's see. So, again, the objective of that was to just try and determine where we're aligned, where we're not, and then I think this is a really good exercise. I feel like pretty clearly we're in much better alignment than we may have appeared to be in prior to that discussion, so thank you. Where I wanted to try and take us next was to assess our progress. So we got feedback from council on Monday that they are concerned that we haven't had much to show in the way of progress. We certainly have lots of information that we've collected back in the form of responses to questions, exhibits. I've got one, Phil's got one right here that shows current and prior existing well activity in our city and in the county, which is, again, part of the picture. We've got staff continuing to assemble analysis for us. And now we've got our success factors to consider. So what I wanted to try and do is look at the 4 objectives that council had put forth, kind of give ourselves a grade and a % of progress. What do we have to do from here in each of those areas so that we can use that to help guide what our subsequent discussion is going to look like? How do we close the gap in any of those areas to say we got to go from here to there in order to provide some level of recommendation? Or we think we can get to here with a recommendation, but there's still going to be this left out if we're, wrapping up discussions in 2 weeks versus 4 weeks. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So Tracy, maybe I can steal your penmanship again? Since we didn't have any of those.
I would like to just quickly go back on the form that we filled out.
Yeah.
You said something about we all have the mission, or can you read what the instructions were on that real quickly?
Are you talking about the agenda?
No, the little half pieces of paper. Do you have those?
Where did I just set those? Oh.
What was the instructions on?
So considering the mission of the committee.
Okay, the mission of the committee. That's what I'm looking for. I want to make sure that we're all clear.
Yeah, so
because,
you've got that in two forms.
Well,
It's
okay.
the charter and purpose here, and it's the charter put forth in the original document.
Okay,
for the
just to
committee.
simplify, I want to make sure that we're all on the same page here.
Yep.
Because the mission of our group is to protect the health, safety, and the public welfare of this community to the greatest extent possible.
Yep.
So, we've got charters, we've got all these other things, and somehow I missed,
Yeah, so
that.
let's-
So is that something that we can agree on? Is that something that we all at the table agree on, that really the mission of this committee is to protect the health, the safety, and the public welfare of this community to the greatest extent possible? Because that's our mission statement.
And I respect and applaud it.
Okay.
I personally, that's
Right.
one of my driving forces as well.
Okay.
From a,
100%, because you've got 7 people up here that, and I know mine is one of them, that was like.
Right. Right.
I'd say from our perspective, this is our
Right.
number one.
if I can just take a chance to respond, I think from a technical perspective, the committee, which is bigger than any one of us as an individual, which was requested by council to be formed and come away with a work product, had these 4 bullets as its mission. So as a committee, that's what we're to come away with together. As individuals, we each bring all of the constituents that we represent. So for me, it's an entire community. For you, it's everybody that's part of your group and the entire community.
Right.
And
So,
so
and I don't want to beleaguer it. I don't want to get
Yeah.
bogged down with a lot of minutia, but I just want to make sure we begin with the end in mind, and that is where we want to end up. In
Yeah,
a position where we are protecting the health, the safety, the public welfare of this community to the greatest extent possible. I just want to make sure we begin with the end in mind and that we're all in agreement with that.
So how about this for a way to address that? I think we had a consistent 100% buy-in to that statement. And if I were to align that statement to the objectives that council set forth, which is to provide a written recommendation for considerations on the ordinance and determine changes to the city's land development code. One thing that's not explicitly stated here that we've talked about quite a bit is an MOU, right? So that would be between the city and COGCC and potentially industry. Sure.
Now, what are we writing down up here?
Well, what I'm just trying to do, because I think it's an important question, and I don't want to just run past it.
Uh-huh.
So if we all believe that that is
Right.
an important motivator for us, what are the ways in which we're going to solve that? And so there are some things that we as a committee won't be able to bring to finality, right? We're directed to put recommendations in front of council. We're going to start sending some of those back as soon as Monday.
Right.
So what you said to think of the end first. So if we think about the end, what are some possible ends that this committee could expect to achieve?
Right.
So one of those is an MOU. So
I'll let you go.
that
Go ahead.
spells out things that we gain agreement between the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission and industry in the city that will be practices applied to all activity in our community. Now, that MOU could address not just the city proper, but a geographical area that would include the county, areas that we couldn't directly influence through our land development code.
Right.
So that might be one.
I don't think that should be one, because I'm not sure where an MOU came in, because I think an MOU is not really what we're looking for. A memo of understanding is...
We as in Jody, we as in your group, or we as a committee?
No, I think an MOU is not something that is going to protect the health, the safety, and the public welfare of the community to the greatest extent possible. An MOU is not. And
Well, I think a rule would be, I'm concerned about this being an agreement. How is it enforceable? And if the city makes a rule, then it's a rule, and there's consequences for not complying with that.
So let's take that to the two gentlemen from the legal side of the team, and let me just restate the question. you've got an MOU, and the question is defensibility or strength of an MOU with regard to anything that's set forth in it versus city regs. And to just kind of set that up quickly, I think the first key difference is that city regs are city regs. So if we look at our map, every little bit of that map that's not in the city, they don't apply. And much of that, like the well closest to your house, sits in a county out of our control. So an MOU could have governance over that or have control or influence over that activity. So the question then is, to what extent might that influence that activity? And what is the defensibility or how binding is that agreement?
Well, an MOU, by its terms, is a memorandum of understanding. So it's not a legally binding contract. Okay? So you have to start with that as your foundation. The MOU that's being discussed is whether industry is part of that MOU or not would be something that would go beyond what the city would be able to regulate. So if you consider what the city can regulate from a preemption perspective, you consider the MOU as a tool to help the city extend its regulations beyond the boundaries of the city and beyond what may be preempted through state statute to certain areas that the COGCC and possibly the industry as well would agree to regulate. In other words, the MOU would sort of put conditions of approval on permits, et cetera, that would be more, I don't want to say region-wide, but that would extend possibly beyond the boundaries of the city, which is all the city can regulate at this time is through its land development code, just within the boundaries. So an MOU could actually extend beyond that, possibly into the city's growth boundary, unincorporated Adams County.
So what are the drawbacks to an MOU? If we did an MOU with, say, Hillcore, would that apply to every single oil and gas company that came in and wanted to drill in our city?
Well, let me say you wouldn't do an MOU with Hillcorp.
So
you would do an MOU
is with who?
With the COGCC.
Okay.
So as any operator came in with seeking a permit from COGCC, the MOU between the city and the COGCC would place certain conditions on the granting of that permit, those conditions that are beyond the city's ability to regulate. So,
right, okay. So what are the drawbacks? What are the drawbacks of an MOU if we were to put one in place? I mean, you're telling us that the positives are that we potentially would be able to expand more, but what would be the drawbacks of an MOU? And you said it wasn't legally defensible. What does that mean?
Well, no, I didn't say it wasn't legally defensible. That's a word that's
been used.
Enforceable. Yeah, enforceable. It's not a legally binding contract. All right, so a legally binding contract, and I have to be careful because I'm an attorney. I represent the city of Commerce City, and so I can't be giving you legal advice or anybody else on this committee other than city council members. But
we don't have an attorney, so if you could explain that to us, that would be great.
I'll give you the quick and dirty. MOU is a memorandum of understanding, and if drafted correctly to be a memorandum of understanding, if one or another party to that MOU were to breach some agreement, the other party, the non-breaching party, wouldn't have any standing to sue or to make a claim against the party in breach. In other words, the party that didn't fulfill its obligations under the MOU, there's nothing about the MOU that would allow the other party to do anything about that.
So if we did an MOU with the COGCC and Hillcore came in and violated part of that, we would have no recourse?
That's no.
Okay. There's a lot of, and I don't want to beleaguer this point, but I think that we're very concerned about an MOU.
I think it's an important discussion, and let me just kind of step forward and then we'll step back.
Sure.
Somebody once told me this great saying, there is no silver bullet to a problem like this, but there is a lot of silver buckshot. So how do you pick up all the right pieces to assemble to load that shell? And to me, in a simplified way, you got the state regs, which are established and revised as of 2008, and I think we all would agree that there are opportunities to further those state regs. But we don't have direct control of that. We have indirect control. So you as a citizen, we as a council could plea to the COGCC to change aspects of those rules. We have the city regs, and at some point, there's a limit to what we can or can't regulate. So we need to get to a point that we all understand and identify what elements we want to seek change around. And that leaves this big unknown. So whether or not you enact an MOU, be in addition to those two pieces, and please jump in here if I'm overstepping my definitions, you're out in an area that we don't have any control over. So in my mind, some control is better than no control. So if you don't proceed with an MOU, to kind of take your question, then it's the Wild West, right? So if we, for example, the well next to South Lawn sits in the county, we can do all we want on this front, and it will only complement what's already in place here, right? Meaning, nothing here affects that well, right? Only this affects that well. However, if we align on points here, then those could have bearing on that well. So I guess the question then is, if permit conditions are defined and permit conditions are not met or breached, what is the recourse in that regard? Is that a better way to look at?
Let me give an example of an MOU. This may help clarify it. Recently, Gunnison County, which has been in litigation with some oil companies for about 8 years, entered into a memorandum of understanding with the Commission, which allows Gunnison County to conduct inspections to determine whether there have been violations of Oil and Gas Commission regulations, which is beyond what the law typically would allow. I mean, that normally would be the duty and the responsibility of the Commission inspectors, but because of this memorandum of understanding, Gunnison is now able to do it in their jurisdiction. Now, the Commission tomorrow could say, we don't want to be part of that. Gunnison could say the same thing. But while it's in force, presumably Gunnison County can go out there and do these inspections where, if they, in fact, they had passed regulations that said, we're going to conduct the inspections, and the court said, no, you're not, because that's the Commission's jurisdiction. So they came back and did a memorandum of understanding. That's sort of the limits. Now, you're saying what happens if somebody violates a permit condition?
That's been established through that MOU.
Well, if the MOU, let's just pick an example, said you can't operate on Sundays, and the Commission signed off on that, and in theory the Commission puts a condition of approval on a permit that says you can't operate on Sundays, the Commission would then have authority to shut the operation down if they were operating on Sundays.
Shut them down forever, or shut them down for?
Probably shut them down for Sundays.
For Sundays.
To require compliance with that MOU.
So it would really come down to the details of what was negotiated in that MOU that was agreed to as a permit condition in the area addressed by the MOU. So while the MOU itself doesn't have the same standing as a contract or state law, it influences a document and a process, i.e. the permitting process, that is enforceable. Is that a way to, for me to think about it?
I think that's fair, and clearly you would want to try to get industry to sign on to those kinds of practices at the same time.
So how are the stipulations of the MOU enforced? And by whom? How are they enforced? When you come up with when you finalize an MOU, how are they enforced, and who does that?
If you have an agreement with the Oil and Gas Commission, you can't enforce it unless the Commission does it itself, unless it becomes a condition of a permit.
Okay, so we would then be reliant on their inspectors to catch or to do or inspect.
Correct.
Mm-hmm.
So let's use your example of no O&G on Sunday. And that's in the MOU. We all sign on to it. It becomes a condition of a permit. I observe activity on Sunday. I now report that. Don't wait for the inspector to see it. That's an enforceable violation of the permit through the existing reporting process, or is there not a way for that to happen?
You'd have to let the Commission know, and the Commission would then take action if they agreed that there was action on Sunday in violation of the permit.
But at least you have an avenue that, had you not structured or agreed to the MOU and agreed to the permitting process, to potentially address that thing.
Correct.
So it's nothing or it's something. It's not everything. It's something.
But is it everything we should and could be getting? That's my question.
Well, I mean, I get where you're going.
Right.
Because in the ideal, from how I hear you, we want nothing. Right? If I put myself in, if I use your words, no oil and gas.
Right. Let's just say this is a good starting point.
Yeah.
We've identified that there's an issue. Let's just say it's a good starting point. Maybe we could move on. But again, we don't have an attorney, and I think the people that we rely on that have had experience are sitting out there. So we don't, we'll talk to them and we'll discuss that with them. But I think this is a good starting point because but I want to make it known that MOUs are a big concern, and it seems like we've moved from moratoriums into MOUs, which I don't know if that is protecting the health, the safety, the public welfare of this community to the highest extent possible.
Well, let's pick that up real quick, the question of the moratorium. So let's say tomorrow...
Can I ask a question? Okay.
Just one second, let me put this in, I want to throw it back to you. Let's say tomorrow we pass the moratorium. Mm-hmm. It's 6 months. Mm-hmm. It's not forever.
Right.
And if we do that, the odds of striking this, to the extent that it helps get us somewhere down the road, probably doesn't happen. So what you then get is this and this plus 6 months of whatever we set forth.
Right.
And then it's gone. So either you solve for world peace in 6 months and kill fracking, right?
No, and that's
or,
not, and I think that's being, I think it's exaggerating.
I'm taking it to the extreme for
Right.
just for illustration's sake. So we're hung up on 6 months, a 6-month moratorium. It's not going to be a perpetual moratorium.
Well, we
it would end
realize
in 6 months. So if we did that, then what do? What's happening in that 6-month time frame that's going to put us in a better position?
What's happening?
No, I want to play this out for a second. If we pass a 6-month moratorium and give up on this process and this process, in 6 months, when that moratorium expires, what do?
Is this a question or is?
So, no, it's a question. I'm looking for input from the committee.
Within those 6 months, we go through as far as city regulations, state regulations, and see what we can do in between that time. Also consider the fact, right now with our land development code, we can change in that. So we have to hit all sides. We just can't sit on one thing out of the three. We had to hit all three. All three cylinders have to go at the same time.
Right.
So all need to be right. We all need to go in 3 different directions on this.
So if through this committee we're gaining ground on this, and we're identifying things in this that we want to ask C or GCC to fix permanently, and we're doing that along the way.
There should be things that are set for Commerce City as far as state regulations, mainly because where we sit with the Rocky Mountain Arsenal. That's a huge concern because we are not like any other city, county, or cities, our position
Certainly,
with
right.
the Rocky Mountain Arsenal. So that should be huge. I know there's state representatives right now that want to do things. They really want to push things, but and between that, we also could look at the MOU based on setbacks. And right now, with the land development code, you can only do drilling that I saw in the development code, in industrial area and in public zoning, correct?
Okay.
Jason, I would like to ask
Yeah,
Jody.
go ahead and jump in.
If you could word this number 1 on Jason's list, exactly how would you word it?
What do you mean it's number 1?
Well, and I would actually.
I don't. Here's the thing. I think we're getting the
Just
cart.
tell us exactly what you want.
Here, you know what? I couldn't tell you exactly what I want because I think we're getting the cart before the horse because I don't think we can go to MOUs. I don't think we can go to regulations until we adequately address the Rocky Mountain Arsenal, until we address, we talk to people from other communities.
Like you said there with the air, it is being addressed. We can't really talk about that because we don't know exactly.
Exactly. We don't know about it.
We need a baseline test. We need to find out what minute maximum should we try to allow, because the state says they allow a certain amount, but if you have, I mentioned this before last week, if you have 2 wells and they emit that amount, that's fine.
Right.
If you have 200 wells and they amount the same
Exactly.
amount, shouldn't the amount be reduced from each well? If we don't know that, we need to get some.
Right. So let's just use that as another example. if we set aside all action, what I'm essentially hearing is, let's set aside any individual line item actions in order to get all the answers and then have a comprehensive proposal of actions. Is that?
Yes.
Okay. So in the meantime, we say we're not going to touch our land development code. We're not going to try and get any concessions from industry. We're going to wait. Somebody decides to challenge our 6-month moratorium. I'm just
Right.
sake
Okay.
of illustration. We're busy solving for everything to come back with a comprehensive set of proposals.
So what you're saying is we shouldn't have a comprehensive set of proposals. Right.
Well, I guess no. I think you take it in a chunk by chunk approach. I mean, this is so the process ends when it ends, right? Which is sometime in the distant future. But if you know that now you can at least shore up your current city regs, and you can get that implemented, period. You're going to continue to work on your air and water analysis to determine, with the proper amount of homework, what the city can do, what the city can't do, right? I mean, does that make any sense?
Here's my problem with the MOU. It's a noble goal, but it assumes that they're going to agree. It's a memorandum of understanding. That we agreed and they agree on some common ground. And as we've discussed before, I think we'll drive down that road as far as we can, but we're going to split at some point. Because there are things I can guarantee you that to comply with number one, protecting the safety and welfare of our citizens, we're going to ask for things they don't want to give us because it's going to cost them money. Granted, they're making a lot of money, they can afford it, but they're not going to see it that way. They want it in their pockets. So we're going to have to deviate, and I don't think that you can get an MOU when we're deviating that, at that distance. We're going to say we want this. They said no, we're not going to do that. Well, how about would you agree to this? And it's going to be something we don't want. And so then our only recourse would be regulations. Now, would they agree to MOU on some things and we'll make rules about others? I think their penalty for that, they're like, well, you're going to put those rules in place, forget the MOU. You know what I mean? I think any action is going to negate the possibility of MOU. It's a nice goal. I just think in the end it's not going to work out.
Okay, so
That's not true. That is not true. Because the same process has been in effect in a lot of other instances of negotiations with this city. And one that you want to bring up the bells is the arsenal. The arsenal started out as a negotiation process and started out as MOUs that went into regulations, that went into remediation. But it didn't, we asked for the moon out of the arsenal. And guess what we got? When we finally finished, we didn't get the moons, but we at least got out in space. If you don't ask for it, you don't get anything. And to take the MOU off the table is saying, okay, say we were to.
I wouldn't take it off the table. I would say we'll drive down that road as far as we can. And at some point, we're going to put this MOU, and they're going to say, well, we won't give you that, and we're going to have to, just in the back of my mind, realize we're going to have to deviate from that plan. I think we're going to end up without an MOU. But I would say pursue it as far as you can. I just don't think it's going to be the end result.
Councilman McEldown,
yeah, go ahead.
if I can make a comment. As it pertains to the MOUs, first of all, the MOU is not with the oil and gas company. It's with the COGCC.
Right.
And they're putting legally binding requirements on their permit. That's the first part. The second part is, and looking at it from a health, safety, and welfare standpoint of our citizens, anything that we do regulation-wise or moratorium-wise only affects plots of land that are within the limits of the city of Commerce City. There are many, many drill sites in the Northern Range that are not under our jurisdiction. The big advantage that the MOU gives us is the ability to do overarching conditions through COGCC that apply to all well sites in the Northern Range, whether they're in the city or in an unincorporated county.
Well, and that's a good point, because we did have an analysis done by Wes Wilson on, and we didn't get the information we needed, but he went ahead and put it together. And looking at Commerce City, just with Halliburton, we have total number of wells Commerce City only 200 wells. I mean, this is serious business. I mean,
It is.
You know, we have to have these discussions about MOUs. We have to have discussions about what's right, because we've put the numbers together, and 200 wells within Commerce City, given our history with Rocky Mountain Arsenal, blows my mind.
But Jody, can I just ask a clarification? You're saying Wes did an analysis that, by his reckoning...
It's because we couldn't get the exact information. He did an estimate. It's a fairly conservative estimate, too. So.
But that was taken into consideration.
200 wells,
and this is just Hillcore.
200 wells possibly within the city limits?
200, a conservative estimate, just with Hillcore in Commerce City. And I guess that's the answer to the question, why are we talking about this and bringing the concern up? Because of that very fact. That is a conservative estimate.
And I'm not saying don't do the MOU. It'd be fantastic if you get an MOU and say, outside the city of bounds, you agree to this, and we'll make some additional rules to get this and this. And if they go along with that and they say, okay, that'd be fantastic. But I'm just saying,
And that's all I'm saying.
pursue this as far as we can.
Right. So rather than get consumed in immediately what we're doing tomorrow in regs, what we're doing tomorrow in an MOU, what we want to go and ask the state and petition our elected officials at the State House or in the U.S. House to do, to me it's a matter of getting back into the finer points of, when we say this is a really broad statement. What do we really mean in explicit terms? And how do we structure a discussion to come away with the line items that we want to solve for that would either land as a new city reg, or we want to have considered as an MOU item, or we want to petition the state on?
Well, yeah, that's what we have on those other items on that list. A meeting associated with air, and we'd like to bring in some people that we've chosen to talk about air quality, and then talk about where is the air quality being compromised, and where can we stop it? Can we contain it? Can we make it so it is protecting the health and safety and welfare of the citizens? And then go from there, and just in the next meeting talk about the water, and then make sure we cover those subjects, that we have people that we know we can trust. They will cover those subjects, and then how we can mitigate those.
So I think, again, at the risk of speaking for council, who gave me and I think our members of this committee marching orders Monday night, we need to come back with recommendations. And now, those recommendations may not be final. They may be partial.
Can you define recommendations, please?
We need to give recommendations on actions that we want the city council to take vote on.
Okay. So I think we have those.
These are not specific. So we need to literally...
So let's drill it down.
Right. And so we've tried for a couple weeks to try and say, of all the information we've collected, what do we need to know more about in specific terms? What can we start to move forward on?
So let's start moving forward on this. Let's take a look at this stuff and put plans in place.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
So that would be great to schedule the air meeting, the water meeting, and then some of the geologists, because we never not completely discussed that, and get those answers, and then we can get all the regulations from other places that we know about, put them all together, and
so that's happening, right? We've got staff and council assembling that, so we can literally sit down, maybe even as soon as next week, to at least look at a draft of what that's looking like, right? What the gaps are, our regs versus potential regs, in rough terms, and that's going to take a while to take it all the way through, right? Is that a...
Well, and we have some sample regulations as well, but I think, again, that's getting the cart before the horse, because we have those in place, and whether those will be good enough or not, I think largely depends on, number one, air pollution assessment, the RMA assessment, looking at these numbers. I mean, I don't think we could do anything without looking at the number and the potential right here, the 200. I don't think anybody realized the massive amount of wells just with Hillcore.
And I think, so when I think about what the context of a recommendation might look like. Mm-hmm. It might say, we've taken through staff and our external counsel's work, analyzing all model regulations, right? Because they've got those. Same ones that you've got, they've got, and they've looked at all the localities in our region that have also enacted to see how we line up. So they'll complete that exercise. We'll have that to consider. And that tells us, to a degree, how far we can go in certain areas where they think we can do so without challenge and with challenge. That then becomes something that we can hand over as a committee to council and say, this is this piece of the puzzle. council's got to have to make a vote on that, right? We could give all the recommendations we want in this regard, and council could say, that's fine, we're going to head down this path. On the other hand, we want to add additional things, right? We want council to proceed further on this water and air analysis, and we want council to look at these other pieces. So when we put our recommendation forward, we can ask that those be part of the further analysis to help make a final decision.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yes, and as long as all of those things that we're bringing forward to the council who have been elected by the citizens are doing exactly what we want, yeah, I mean, that's great. How do we do that? I mean,
Right.
I think that's what we keep talking about, but we're not doing it exactly right now. So, I mean, if you want, we could move into that. I think that would speed the process
I think
along.
that will
We can
help
start
us.
looking at that.
I guess what I was trying to get, what I was hearing, and maybe I'm mishearing it based on what I'm hearing, I hear you saying now, is I've sensed that you guys want to get to the point of final answers before we give a recommendation to council. And I think we can give a recommendation to council that says, you need to take further action here and further action here to fully inform on your final decision.
Right.
Is that a fair way to say
the
it?
recommendations from our perspective would be, we need to do an air pollution assessment. We need to do a water assessment. We need to do a legal analysis on total ban of fracking. We need to bring a community in that has oil and gas in their city, and we need to talk to them about what's worked, what hasn't worked. We need to, in my mind, most importantly, address the Rocky Mountain Arsenal question, which we have never really, I mean, it remains a looming concern for, I think, most citizens as well as us.
Jason
Yeah.
and Tracy wants to bring up a point.
Yeah.
Oh, you can, go ahead, either one.
No, go ahead.
Oh, no, I just wanted to remind you that, we do have an obligation to this, and I know Jody is 100% on board with hearing from the citizens at 8:45 this evening. So we want to make sure that we've got to get there, so the citizens that have been so kind to be waiting with their children and everything will have a chance to speak. So
Thanks, Tracy, for keeping us back on track. So we had sought at this piece of the agenda to at least give ourselves a rough progress report on the 4 key areas that we can have this committee take back to council, at least on Monday night, and say, okay, for the 4 areas that you chartered us to solve for, we think we're here, and we have X amount more to deliver. And I think we can take these inputs and you plug those in some respects to this. So to your point, we need you to look at doing an air analysis, a water analysis, the arsenal analysis.
And I think that one last thing, just really quickly. I think everything that encompasses that is, what Wes had put together, where we look at the leases and we look. I think that the staff needs to put that together so that we can accurately figure out. It's not 200; it's 222. So I think that's vital information, and then that encompasses all of this.
Right, and so what Wes's information tells us, just to kind of touch on that quickly. And we can do that, I think we talked about last week, in a rough sense. We can say, do you have your map handy still? So there are X number of 1 square mile plots that touch Commerce City or unincorporated Adams County inside of our growth boundary. And the maximum density of wells on each square is roughly 16. So 16 times X could tell us, in an ultimate worst case scenario, the maximum intensity of drilling, if we use that as a planning value, right? And so from there, you could say, well, what happens if you're drilling every single one of those wells simultaneously, right? And we know from the discussions that we've had so far, trying to learn about the process and in the intensity of that process, you've got 20 days of activity to drill a well. And we can roughly calculate how many trucks are coming through to affect that activity, right? So if we've got 1 well going on at a time or 5 wells going on at a time, that's exactly the rough math that we can use to start to get a sense of intensity, which will guide what we want to ask for on the roads thing, right, on the other side, or otherwise. And I think we don't need explicit detail. We need a planning level detail that gives us sort of that worst case, mid case to worst case. We don't know and can't know how much activity is going to happen at any one time. So we've got to be reasonably projecting where in that range it could happen. And that's going to tell us. I mean, we've only got so many major roads, right? What happens if you've got X amount of truck traffic going on Tower and 104th, and they're already at capacity? It's a terrifying prospect. So we can plan roughly, and I think the key is, if we know that, beyond knowing the absolute microns of pollution of a certain type that are going to be produced, we know, I mean, it's just intuitive to say it's going to be more than it is today, and we're going to need to do something about that. So to what extent can we do something about that, and to what extent do we need the state to do something about it, or do we need to ask for them to do something about it through voluntary mitigation, right? So I feel like in some respects we could literally sit down and start to rough out that straw man, if you will, of the different things we want to solve for and put it in front of council. I mean, I think to your point, we're closer than...
Yeah, it's a great starting point.
Okay. So we're 15 minutes away from our citizen communication. Let's give do you want to give our rough grade so we can have council take that back? I won't be at council Monday, but I've asked Ray and Steve to bring back a report. So this will help give them something to frame. So in regard to promoting dialogue among interested parties, what would we give as a grade on our progress to date?
Okay.
This is item 4, second page of your agenda.
Item 4.
I say dialogue while, I mean, on that subject of our dialogue with the interested parties, I think that's, so far, to me, they're interested. I haven't seen, as far as separating from the table, they want to know what our needs are and see what our progress is. So
let me take a shot at wording it differently and see what your answer is. So in my simple wording here, I said promote dialogue among in the simple wording of our charter. So it's, when we say interested parties, it's citizens, it's council,
right.
It's industry, it's the state, it's anybody who has the water district who we've had engaged, or Tri-County.
So
how do you think we're doing in general in that regard?
I say so far it's been a B.
Okay.
We've
A what?
a B, because the citizens, I mean, have, like right now we're having the citizens here, and it's come to a point where we need to hear from the citizens. And I think by our dialogue that's been going on so far has got to this point right now. So I'm giving this, I'm rating it as a B. What do you see it as?
For me, personally, being on the committee, I'd rate it as an F, simply because we've brought concerns forward, and not to be adversarial at all, but this is a really a big issue for us, where we've asked and we've said, we all have day jobs, so we need people to come here so we can continue the dialogue. But we, number one, we've never been able to address that. Out of all of these, it's the only one that I feel really is the failing grade, because number one, we need to have some additional people on the citizen committee.
Okay.
We have to. And in terms of, the communication, I think that our citizens have to wait. They have to speak at the end. They get, 10 or 15 minutes, and they're very interested. And, the last meeting, we had people that signed up that when we called their names, they had left. So I think that, affording them that dialogue just hasn't happened. That's been, in my mind, very bad.
Okay, so I just want to capture some of the feedback, and again, I think this goes into what we solve for inside the committee and what we need to find ways to solve for. And so to me,
right.
I value the feedback on the community, on the communication with the community. Sorry, too many C's. But I think it's important to crystallize the difference between what a committee is and the function of the committee and the function of other ways to enhance or engage in the community dialogue, right? So when we look at a committee, whether it's the committee that we formed, Steve, like you participated in for the comp plan, or any other committee that might be assembled, those committees are intended to be representatives of different interest groups who convene for those discussions. It's not a wide open working group in that respect, so you're there to participate in that small group, if you will, and we need to find ways to help bolster the dialogue outside of that committee. So what I hear you saying is we're not able to do so in the committee in the way that we've been dealing with it, so we need to recommend to council ways to help improve that community engagement in this process. Is that a fair way to say
The
it?
community engagement in that process, and then I also feel, I think we were, when we met in the room over there 2 meetings ago, the feedback is we really didn't, there was no dialogue from us, and when we sat very quietly and listened to the presentations, but there was really no...
Yeah, the RMA used up all the time, and
Okay.
we couldn't ask questions that we wanted to ask because it was time to go.
Okay. And so to balance and I'm just trying to watch time. I don't want to cut us off. And if we're open to stay a little bit, then I want to do that. But
Definitely the citizens, I think, Jason, really, felt left out. And I think that they really want to have that opportunity to speak and be heard. So I think that's extremely important.
it is important.
One
Yeah.
thing we can do is to have the citizen communication at the beginning of the meeting, like we do at the council meetings.
Yep. I think it's a great recommendation.
I think that's, I was thinking about that this week, that why force people to wait the whole time? Everybody has to get home and take care of their families, their kids, whatever. So can we do that? Because I can't vote, but
We're going to take these all down and we'll come away with a set of recommendations.
I would give us a C so
Okay.
far. I'm not going to give us a failing grade, but we haven't come close to accomplishing what my idea is of getting this thing worked out as far as we can.
So from a dialogue perspective, your grade is a C. Dan, how about you?
Well,
sorry.
as far as tonight is concerned, in an hour and a half, we've done about 4 times as much as we did in 4 hours last week. So I think this meeting was very helpful.
That's excellent.
And I've asked, what do we do? Gosh, I can't see anything without these. Activities still needed. I've asked Dan, and I would ask Jody also, come up with a list, 1, 2, 3, 4, about exactly what tests you won't run, what you're looking for, so we know exactly what you want.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't mean that we're going to do all of that, but I want to know exactly what you want, because I don't know that yet. I've
And
never seen it.
It sounds like we've got a good start on
Yeah,
that.
we've got a great start.
Okay.
Great start on it,
Yeah.
but I would like to see a list, and can you get me that list?
So for
I
mine,
think we got the start for that list.
but just
right?
really quickly, we needed to add more people to our committee to enhance it and to keep that dialogue going.
We will, and I will
Right.
just in all fairness say, when we say that, because I've asked you directly, I've asked Mr. Douglas directly, we get the request for more people, and I've said, do we have specific people and specific roles? What is it we want? In other words, when we add people to the committee, what are we gaining?
We want to just add them to the citizen here, because we've been held to very strict standards, I think, and that's why I'm giving you a failing grade, because we've been held to very strict standards of who can and who cannot sit at the table, when other groups were able to just kind of rotate in and out.
Yeah.
And
And
that was my biggest concern. So number one, again, we all have day jobs. It would be great to have the 3 of us plus an additional 3.
Okay.
And then we added.
So just to make sure I capture it, because we want to take these back
Right.
to council. The request is that the committee, if we continue beyond, and for whatever period of time we continue, we want 3 primaries and 3 alternates. Is
Well,
that
we
a
just
fair
want
way to
6
say it?
people.
A
where
more
3 people
balanced,
was-
a more
right.
balanced.
A more balanced, exactly. So we want 6 people, and then we have the 3 people sitting at the table. Whoever can make it that day, or whoever's not traveling for work or has a sick child, then the 3 people can come to the table. And then we had the addition of Mr. Conrad, I believe, the last meeting that he's joining. So, in addition to balancing that out, we'd like to have Sandra Jagwith added, since she was part of the RMA as well.
Mr. Conrad is not here of his own accord. Mr. Conrad is here because people ask about air and water quality on the arsenal. And if you want an expert to come in and speak on air and water quality, you ask Tri-County Health, because they were one of the regulators. The gentleman from the Colorado Department of Health was asked to come because nobody actually, I don't think they believed what Tri-County said, so they wanted to get somebody else to verify that Tri-County was telling the truth.
Those are putting words in our mouth. That's not.
I'm going to let me just close this one out first, and then let's hit that. We're going to we'll put in this list a recommendation to
Right.
council from the citizens that speaks to the number of primary and alternate
Right.
membership.
Right.
What I hear is, and this I think is where Renee was going, we've continued to try and identify other experts other than the core of this committee that we want to either have here in attendance for referring to for questions or to take follow-up on questions. And so as we identify additional areas of expertise, we want to be able to ask staff to bring those in. Is that a fair way to say it?
Absolutely. And again, in response to Renee and bringing the Tri-County Health people in, there's some people that don't have the same belief that the Tri-County people do. So we want to balance that. If we're going to be bringing people in, we want to make sure that we have people that also know about it that can balance out that panel. So we want the 6 people. We'd like to add Sandra Jackwith because RMA is a pivotal issue for us. She was involved 20 years with the RMA remediation. We would like to have her come in and balance it out in that.
And I've got
great.
it
And we
clear.
can we can move on.
Who do you want doing the air quality analysis?
We don't know that
Who
now.
do you, well, we need to know that.
Well, I don't have that
party.
right now.
Yeah.
That's a good starting point.
We've got the request.
Right.
Let's identify a list of possible.
Find out exactly what they want so we can do it. If we
Okay,
can.
let's-
I don't have any idea right now.
Guys, we have 3 minutes before we need to move to citizen communication.
Yes, Jim.
I want
The
to,
ability to have an outside, in addition to the substitute members, have to have an outside, just call in outside experts when we need members.
and I think we've made that a blanket. We've all agreed that that's necessary. So as we identify a discussion area, we want to do that. And part of the reason we were trying to set outward agendas was so that we could give sufficient notice. So we've got to get ourselves back on a track that we can have those agendas set so that we can get the right folks here with appropriate lead time and all that
Perfect.
good stuff. So I'm with you on that. What was your grade?
I'd say D because of the like I said, these meetings we've had so far, they've presented the COGC, the RMA, the one before was COGCC, the RMA was the last time, and it just took a whole time. We go, but
Yep.
no, we got to keep going. Okay, never mind.
I got you, buddy. Okay. Renee, your grade? Your grade?
Oh, Dan didn't give his grade.
Yes,
yet.
he did.
Or what did you give?
You give a D.
Gave a D.
D. I would say a D.
Okay. And anything to help close that gap?
Yes, we got to quit spinning our wheels. If we get to a subject and our most important aspect is to protect the health and safety of the public. And I believe everybody believes that's the number one goal of this committee. Because if safety isn't our number one priority, then all the rest of this stuff is just a bunch of minutia. But we have a whole citizens. We have a whole city full of citizens. And I'm seeing this being polarized down to one area because I got stopped at the rec center last week. And I talked to about 8 seniors that they don't think that their message is being heard one bit because they have a different message as what's being brought forth. And so if you're going to represent the citizens, represent all the citizens. Don't just take a message from a group and say this is the group that is representing Commerce City. No, they're not. They're representing a section of Commerce City. And if you want to hear what everybody's got to say, show up down at the rec center for a birthday lunch and see what they say to you. Because you might get a totally different message, and then you have to change your whole directive and your whole chain of thought because you're representing everybody, not just a polarized community.
No.
Thanks, Renee.
Okay, no, okay.
Tracy, your grade and your suggestions for how to...
Yeah, just briefly. I think that, up until tonight, I think we all know that the meetings have not gone well at all. So I was kind of going between a D and an F, honestly. I'd probably say a D. Tonight I think we're doing a little better. But one of my suggestion for promoting dialogue, among interested parties would be to put a postcard out to the entire city saying that we're having these meetings. And so everybody will know that's out there, because I just don't think that many people know that we're doing this. So we need to put a postcard out there and plenty of time for the citizens to make plans in their schedule to be here. That's my biggest suggestion for that.
Okay. Great
Thanks.
stuff. So I want to pause so we can go to the citizen communication portion of our agenda.
What's your grade?
I'm sorry?
What's your grade?
Oh, my grade? If I sit...
You should be given a grade. You
Technically,
are
I'm the facilitator, but I will hazard a grade just at the risk of throwing this into a tizzy. How's that?
I don't think we need to be in any more of a tizzy.
If I look at where we started, just at the middle of December, and where we sit today, I would say we've gone from 0 to C in that time. I think we certainly have valid feedback here on how to improve the process. I think we have to be creative about how we leverage the committee and find other avenues to improve the dialogue beyond this committee. Tracy's point about postcards is a way to complement that. We've tried to put information, every bit of information we come across through the committee on the city website. So the question is, are the things we're doing having an impact over what we weren't doing before? And I think we can't say they haven't. Have they had enough, or is it as far as we can go? No, I think we got some room to grow. So that's my take. We are at 8:46. Let's move to citizen communication, and then we will come back and discuss how to close out the agenda, because we've got the discussion of next steps, but I feel like let's pick that up after citizen communication. So do we have the sign-in sheet handy? Is it still back on the... Oh, you got it? Oh, different one.
.42 is not a
Thank you.
Everybody signed it. It's gone around the table. It's good.
Did you want to take hers? Yeah. Okay. So first on the list with a request to speak is Estelle Remington. Let's leave it on the stand and I'll just have her.
Oh, okay.
It's a little heavy.
Hi, my name's Estelle Remington, and I really feel pressured because I want other people to have something to say. But I just want to share my experience. We built a home with our dream house, and we built a home here in Commerce City. And about a year after we built it, we found out on our property was right across from the Rocky Mountain Arsenal, and right in the very drainage area. So when we purchased the home, we were reassured that the city had given the ground okay, and every place where we built that it was proper place to build. We put a lot of money into this home. About a year after we built it, the window well rusted out completely, totally rusted out, and stuff started oozing out of the window of the galvanized window well liner. Then the first thing we noticed that was there were hot spots on the. Am I too loud with this?
You're okay.
There are hot spots in the ground around our house, where if we planted a plant, it would die. We couldn't put rose bushes in. We couldn't put flowers in. My husband is a gardener, and I think we have the only garden in our subdivision. And so he just, he put everything in it. He did everything to try and make something grow, and it would grow for a while, and then it would just die. So we contacted the Army from the Rocky Mountain Arsenal, and contacted a gal named Peggy. I don't remember her last name anymore. And they came over, and they sat in our living room, and they explained how we were not in the floodplain where the chemicals could drain over us, but that they were right next to us in the field. And they said that they couldn't explain why the wells were rusting out and the stuff was oozing. They couldn't explain it. They didn't know what it was. They more or less told us this is going to be our responsibility, and that we had to spend the money and we had to have the soil tested to find out what was going on. At that time, they had maps of where all the contaminants were buried. They had maps of where the water flows. They had maps of everything. So if you would go to the Army has all the figures that we need on the Rocky Mountain Arsenal. They'll give it to us. I don't know if it's public or what, but they can tell us the contaminants that are in there. They can tell us where everything is. But this is what I want to say. Commerce City, the health department, Commerce City, no one in Commerce City protected us when we bought that house. And my husband's hands are starting to, they look like paws. They're swelling up with arthritis so bad from working in that ground and everything. Nobody protected us. Nobody did anything to make sure that the money that we invested in our home, that we were getting what we paid for. Once the buyer bought that land and the builder built on that land, we were on our own. And that's the only thing I'm afraid of with this, that we are going to let these companies come in. Once you have given permission, once we've signed our papers, once we're at that point, they are going to do what they want to do. And the person that is going to pay is going to be you and I. I don't know what we're going to do with our home. I don't know what's oozing out of the wells. I don't know. But I just don't want to see this repeated again.
Thanks very much, Ms. Remington. Just for your knowledge, we did have the Army here, as was mentioned a couple meetings back, and did at least get a high-level review of the flow and talks about the major contaminants in those flows. So certainly a very sensitive subject, and I am sorry to hear that it sounds like there is potentially some impact of that flow on you. And obviously, I didn't live here, you didn't live here at the time that those permissions were given, and I think the concern about a similar exposure with oil and gas is merited. I think the important point there is, if we were to do nothing, the rights are already there. So it's a matter of us trying to figure out what we can do in addition to the existing rights that these people have to take advantage of the mineral rights that they're entitled to act on. So I think it's words that we need to heed, and I appreciate you coming tonight. Ash, I think you're next.
Thanks for all your hard work, 'cause I know these committee meetings have been going on, so thanks to everybody who comes every week. My point that I'd like to bring up is that our dialogue is finally progressing after tonight, definitely not at a speed or a pace that I would prefer. I'd like it to go a little bit quicker, because as Jody has stated, and I concur, it's time to actually start talking about these next steps. And now that we've got this on the table, we need to start looking at the air, the water analysis, and I want the citizens that are sitting on this committee to bring the experts in. I don't want the experts solely identified by council or staff. That is not balanced, and I think that might be my greatest frustration at this point, and I know we've hit that talking point this evening. But again, we've got some experts, and we'd like to get them at the table with an opportunity to present. Let's just expand that aspect of the dialogue. That's all I've got right now. Yeah, I've got that list. I will get that over to you, Jim. Let me amass it.
Can I ask that you go ahead and send that to Tom Aker, T. Aker,
Yep.
at c3gov.com?
Sure.
And he can make sure that the entire committee gets that same list from you then, and then we can look at how that factors in to where we go from here.
Okay.
Thank you.
Will do.
Sharon, looks like you said yes and no. Are you still here, Sharon Chung? Did you want to speak or no? Yeah. Okay.
Hi. This is my first chance to come and see the hearing. It's really very impressive to sit back here. Really concerned people talking about what is really our life. It's very scary. I send out emails to friends and stuff to try to support this notion of looking into what fracking is. And I'm just so impressed that the internet has such a power. And once we get mobilized here, I suspect there's going to be an energy that takes off. Right now it's pretty quiet for what I'm observing, but I know it's going to get really, really big. So hang on and get ready, and thank you so much for showing up and doing this for us.
I would just say thank you, and again, I think with regard to the citizens that are sitting here on the committee to represent you, I think it's important that we get those names out so that you have people, whether it's contacting those of us on council or the citizens who are sitting on this committee, to help is you've got questions, to bring those forward so that we can fully explore those. And I'll just repeat my comment at the top of the meeting. Our goal is to get every question that's been asked and every answer that we've received out there so that everybody has that same information in hand. One of the things I think that's been the biggest challenge for us as a committee is all trying to get up to some common level of understanding of the process, the terms, the facts, the fictions, so that we can start to have those discussions on how to solve for this in our community. So thank you for being here tonight, and I hope to see you further. Was there anyone else who's in attendance that didn't?
Yes, I would like to speak, please. Christy Douglas. Okay. And I would like to say that tonight it was really refreshing to not have the industry people at the table, because it seems we only get their perspective, and they're advocating for what they want, and they want to come in and make money here in our city without the benefit of our input and the ability for us to be able to speak out to protect ourselves. I keep going back to the Rocky Mountain Arsenal and how that whole thing transpired, where people were willing to make those sacrifices to allow the Army to come in and produce those weapons, and then also to lease out part of the property to produce pesticides. And we find ourselves in the midst of living in something that has been remediated, not cleaned up. And so the potential danger is there, and people have to be informed of what this fracking involves, that it doesn't just involve horizontal or vertical drilling, but it also involves horizontal drilling. It involves pressurized chemicals and water and sand being shot into the ground at an incredible PSI, I guess. I've heard that it was 10 times, or it is now 10 times more powerful than what was used in the injection well that caused the earthquakes throughout the 60s and the 70s and into the 80s. And right now we don't even know what's down there, where it's gone, what it's done to the rock formation down there, where the fault lines are. We know that earthquakes have been related to fracking, not just the waste injection wells, but also to the process itself. We have to take the time to explore. I don't understand what the rush is. If we rush to do this and then we find out that it's very, very dangerous and that we could disturb this contamination that has been already injected into a well, that we don't know what's going on down there as it stands right now, what are we getting ourselves into, and what are we allowing these people to come in and do to us without standing up for ourselves? This is where we live. This is where we have made our investment of our lives. It's not just about money. And there shouldn't be a rush to do this. We need that 6 months to investigate what the possibilities are. And I urge everyone to contact your neighbors and start letting them know that these meetings are going on, and we need to unite and band together. Thank you.
Thank you very much. If I could just...
Sorry, one more thing. Christy, you know they didn't put, they told, what's that?
Sorry.
I was just going to tell her. They said they didn't actually put the chemical weapons down there, just the ingredients, so we should feel much better about that. Just the ingredients for chemical weapons. I feel a lot better now, too.
Bombs before they put them down there.
I would just add to your closing comment there about having folks come down here. I think one of the things that I don't want to get lost in the discussion is the acknowledgement of the limitations of what we're going to be able to do as a community and what we need to be collectively doing at the state level. So there was a ton of legislation that just got knocked down, and on the point that we can be, the community can be letting your representatives in the state house and otherwise know, I think it's a multi-pronged approach. We want to continue to hear from the community and continue to investigate and just determine what action we can take here, but there are other fronts that need to be addressed as well. I sense one more comment.
Yeah, my name's Bill Roth.
Remind me of your name, I'm sorry.
It's Bill Roth.
Okay, thanks.
And I didn't sign in tonight.
Okay.
I didn't see the sign-in sheet. I actually think the Memorandum of Understanding is a useful course for us to consider collectively. If we look at the realities of mineral rights, this is an economic discussion. It's an economic discussion for industry. It's an economic discussion for homeowners. Certainly, certainly more important than that is our safety. But when it boils down to it, we're all protecting our property rights. Industry's protecting its rights to explore the opportunities underneath our homes, and we've abdicated those rights. When we built here, when we bought homes here. So, my question centers around the MOU, and I guess my question is it a living document, or is it something that's structured in a way that once it's written in stone with the COGCC that it's set, or if it's something we can revisit in subsequent years?
Thank you for your comments, and I think a good question. My understanding is that, like any document, you can amend and evolve that over time. It's a matter of both parties being willing to do so.
Yeah, an MOU has one or two or more parties, and so yeah, it's a living document. It can be changed, it can be updated, it can and because it's an MOU, either party can say they don't want to do it anymore, and so. And sometimes that gets a new MOU created because one party says this isn't working for us, and the other party says, well, what will work for you? So yeah, it's a living document. It can be amended over time, changed over time.
Thank you. One more question out there, it looks like.
Hi, my name's Kathleen Nicholson. I signed up not to talk, but I just have a couple of comments. I actually came here on accident because I really didn't look at the email I got in extent, just the time and where it was at. But I do agree with that we need to get more people involved. As I don't know if, let's say, you get a certain amount of people and they take a certain section of Commerce City and then they try to get those views for those people so that way they can filter down into one. And then you'll bring in, like Jody said, 6 people or whatever to represent Commerce City. I think that's a good idea. I also think that maybe everybody should come back with a certain plan as far as who they want for all these testings that they want done. You guys are kind of circling around a lot of stuff, and I don't see a definite plan. I don't know Jody at all, but I just heard her name. But I really think she brought up a lot of questions and stuff like that, and you were kind of evasive on them. And I think that was it was irritating. So I think that you actually need to come up with actual answers to what we're questioning about. You need to find out the actual facts of how many wells there are. You need to actually find out where they're going to be doing all this stuff. And every area is not going to be the same because you're going to have different, different aspects coming in to where they're going to be doing this. Because eventually it's probably going to happen. But we just need to kind of protect ourselves on what they're going to be doing and kind of, follow through and make sure they're not going to be overextending to to hurt the community or hurt that area that they're doing it to.
Thank you very much for the feedback, and I think the comments are well placed. Obviously, for anybody who stepped in tonight's meeting without the exposure to the prior meetings, has tonight as a sort of window into these discussions. You're right. Tonight was structured to sort of recenter our discussions. We've had several proposed agendas, if you will, out there to try and logically move through this topic so that we can get the definitive answers documented and get those out to the community and ultimately get them to council for action. And admittedly, we've seen discussions sort of move in ways that were counter to the plan on a given night. And so, again, our objective tonight was to try and bring that back together. I'd love to make sure that you get a copy of the questions and answers that have been received to date. And again, I take seriously the request that we start to show a product for our time together. And I think that's something that we all want to see come out of these discussions. So thank you very much. Again, I'm sorry? Yeah, so thanking everybody again for your comment tonight. We'll go ahead and return to the agenda. We had paused on providing the grade for each of these areas. What I might ask in order to complete that exercise, would the committee and council, or the community and council members be open to submitting those on email so that we can get those compiled, and that way we can use that to help send a report back to the committee for those analysis, if you will. I would also ask that in each of those areas where we were getting these ideas on ways to improve in that given area, that we get those too, so that we don't lose that progress, and we're able to then take that into account. But one of the things that I've heard for a couple meetings is we have more questions, and certainly we've got some of those up on the board with regard to air and water and the arsenal. So it's clear that we've got additional information needed. So in looking at bullet point number 5, discussing next steps, we wanted to ID tasks that we need either committee members to follow up on, staff to follow up on, or industry to follow up on. So let's talk through what some of those are. We heard in the citizen comments the interest in what the wells are, what the positions are. We certainly have some of that. For folks who haven't heard the updates previously, there is a website that the state has on the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission, and again, these links are on our city's page, that enables you to go in and identify wells next to your home all over the state. It's literally every well that's active, that's permitted, and we have a version of that map drilled down to Commerce City, and I believe that is available on our oil and gas webpage, so you can go out and pull that down. The next piece of that question, what's gonna get drilled? And that's the big gray area that we have found ourselves in some interesting discussions. Guys, if I can, Jim and Dan, I'm sorry, if I can just ask, I'm sorry. Sorry. We found ourselves in some interesting discussions with industry on, because we want a definitive answer. They're telling us they can't give us a definitive answer. There's got to be some middle ground we can get to. And so on that front, staff is undertaking a Herculean task to try and identify holdings to give us a sense of what exists to the extent we can define it definitively in the city. And so, again, if we can, Chris, make sure that the committee members get copies of what you've been able to pull together.
Jason, can we also try to identify sites that are right outside the city, but within our boundaries?
Yeah, and that's actually part of that map that we got.
What we can do as a city, I know, we're trying to. What we do as a city, that they could just come right back and be right next door on the county and start drilling, and then we've already asked the county to come forth with a moratorium, and they said no.
Right.
So they could be in the county, close to your house and before, and there's nothing we can do. So that's the sites that worry me more than the city sites.
Totally agree, and it obviously would help inform us in terms of what we want to seek in an MOU. I think and again, this is my 2 cents, and I defer to Mr. Kramer on this. When we look at the county, any of those county plots, we can at least from a planning perspective let's assume that there are the maximum number of allowable wells in that square mile. And so we've heard that on average, the density of drilling in this formation that they're trying to hit is somewhere in the neighborhood of 16, I think is the number that they keep going back to.
9 vertical.
There you-
9 horizontal, 16 vertical.
So if we assume the worst, 16, because that gives us the highest level of intensity, we can at least use that as a planning factor, even if we can't get definitive numbers on who owns what. It lets us plan. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is I don't want to get hung up on we can't make decisions until we get a black and white list of who's going to do what by when. We can make great decisions based on that level of planning data and start to move ourselves forward. And then as that information starts to come forward, certainly it's going to help clarify our estimates, if you will. I don't know if Mr. Kramer or our attorneys want to say anything on that front. Is that reasonable?
Yeah, the information that we actually have here, we just sort of, this is the very, very top surface. We have some well sites that may not be permitted, but that are identified on some zoning documents that we have. It's just for 3 subdivisions in the Northern Range, doesn't cover very much at all. Actually finding the specific leased locations, so they haven't been permitted, right? They've just been leased through some agreement through a mineral rights owner and an operator. I got to tell you that is representing a bit of a challenge. We have been told that, so the world I work in, right, we have subdivision plats, we have zoning. You know, you go down, when we need to record something at the county, we go to the county assessor. There's a whole system set up to do that process. Our understanding, what I've been told is, what we found is the oil and gas process isn't the same. It's a whole new world, and they aren't necessarily, from what I've been told, required to record all of this stuff in the same way. And so tracking this information down is not something we really have very much experience in at all. You know, the industry employs a subgroup of professionals called landmen. That's all they do is track this information down because it's so much more Byzantine, I think, than the world that I'm normally used to working in. So getting specific lease information across the board for the Northern Range, you know, we may need to elicit external help to do that because I'm not sure we have the skill set on staff to track that down. If the question is, can we come back with a sort of, you know, mile by mile section and what could be drilled according to state guidelines about drilling windows, assuming that there weren't surface use agreements that did all those that may or may not be recorded, you know, just sort of the abstract, what could be done, I think we could work with Phil to sort of put something like that together pretty easily. Trying to get the actual specifics about there are actual leases for this many wells across all 18 square miles or whatever it might be of the Northern Range, we'll have to get outside help to do that.
One thing I might say, I was in Adams County today asking about that kind of thing, and it is like picking up peas with the chopsticks. But what you could do is first process, you do this from any computer at home or whatever, is find a current owner and then go back to their title. And on there it should say, this person bought the property, but the rights are with this person. It should be recorded at that point. You may have to go back to that point. So they could be constructed that way. And remember, they want to try to group them together, so there shouldn't be a lot of little ones.
Yeah, the one thing that I've heard, because I had the same idea personally, and the feedback that I've gotten is that because of the Byzantine nature of how that record keeping works, odds are that it's a sort of a dead end trail. That those holdings have either been transferred or assumed or some other transition that's not going to map back. So
well, that's true. If it's after the place is sold, it may not be recorded until it's sold again.
And from what I understand, and again, this is an area that I'm not really been trained in, so we're outside of my expertise. It's my understanding that even then, once some of those leases have been signed, there may be subleases, and not all those then, at that point, since they're between two private parties, are required to be recorded even. So they may even exist at another level that we really couldn't research if we wanted to. And so trying to map sort of the Northern Range with actual leases that will require some additional thinking. And I guess I don't want to set unfair expectations for this group. That doesn't mean that staff doesn't want to provide information that's going to assist you to help make these recommendations. And if the committee, I think what may be much easier and help you, especially given that the next meeting is next week, we could certainly come up with the typical mile by mile and how does the state work on drilling windows, and then if somebody wanted to do, if a surface owner didn't want to have those windows in place, what's the process they would go through, the surface use agreement process. I think we could talk about that next week pretty easily. The map of all future lease sites is
That's fine, as long as we're still working on that. If we have the estimations for next week, I think that would be fine, right?
Yeah,
Bill, and is that fair? Okay.
I think if we can get that from a planning perspective, that would be great. I think because the other research, from what I understand and from what you're reinforcing tonight, there could be significant costs effectively involved in trying to assemble that. That's something that we're going to have to, I think, get a determination on and see if that's the direction that council wants to go to get a definitive mapping versus can we get to a point start making some decisions with sort of a worst case or likely case model that says you got 16 wells per mile happening. Right?
Yeah. I'll try to say this in simpler terms to put it. You're on the right. I don't have it in my budget to do that research.
Right. Understand.
That's the bottom line. I guess.
Well,
so.
And more important, Chris, a couple meetings ago, there were folks from COGCC and the oil companies here, and that question was raised, and I'm going from memory, but what I took away from that is it is actually not possible to find that information because it is not recorded anywhere.
Right. And I have a similar recollection from both that discussion and other discussions. So rather than belabor that, we're going to ask, we'll have council reinforce to staff. We will have staff start. I think we've already had staff start on that exercise.
Is it incorrect to assume that 350 feet away from any building could be drilled on, but there's a piece of land big enough?
I think you could. There's a question, as I understand it, that's still unclear about setbacks of 150 versus 350 based on what the COGCC definition of urban area is. And I know staff and our council are continuing to look at that. So again, I think from a planning sake, if we take that map and we know how many squares make up Commerce City or fall within the growth boundary, they can apply the metrics based on the regs that exist, and we can have something to plan within that could be very close to the reality of what is out there. It won't give us who, but it will give us the fact that it could. And where we do have definitive through PUDs or otherwise, that's certainly another layer of detail that can help add perspective. Is that a fair way to say it, Mr. Kramer?
Yeah, I will say, while we don't know the specifics of the actual leased sites, we're going to come, if we go through that exercise, we're going to come back with 20 drilling windows per section. Right? Well, 20 drilling windows per section. If you do the math on the Northern Range, you're going to come back with hundreds of windows, which means you can have more than one well on each window. I can tell you that I know just from informal conversations, there have been surface use agreements between surface rights owners, in this case usually developers, and mineral rights owners to reduce those. We don't necessarily have those. We don't know how many of those are. So the number we come up with is going to far exceed what the reality is, maybe by a factor of 2 or 3 or some huge number. So now, even if you cut it in half or cut it by a third, it's still a potential lot of number of wells, but it still may not be as much as that math exercise would get you to.
Right. Well, keep in mind, if they are restricted to a certain area, they still want to drain that entire quadrant.
Right.
Below, yes. Yeah.
If they do it in one area, they're still going to drill 8 wells, whatever it takes, and go out.
But yeah, I'm just saying at the surface.
Just to bring this piece of the discussion to a close, we're going to have staff execute that exercise. We know that for our planning sake, thinking about what we can likely regulate on the surface, if they're limited to X number of plots per area, we can, again, at least begin to roughly calculate what that means in terms of truck traffic and days on site to drill X number of wells or frack X number of wells. So that...
Are they going to work on the timeline, too? Because you mentioned
we need to, I think, we need to, I think, we need to, I think 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 we need to, re-request that from Anadarko. I think we can assemble much of that from the information that we got from them.
Maybe just keep this, that one PowerPoint had it in there.
And I believe we have that.
Maybe just get it.
Yep, I will make a note to ask staff to ensure that we have that copy.
They could send me a copy, or all.
The whole committee will get it. The other thing that we asked for, and I think COGCC is still on the hook for this, was, or maybe it was COGA, was the timeline. I think, in fact, COGCC was in the middle of building something in general, and we were supposed to get that copy. So we need to check on the status of that. Were there any other document deliverables that folks can think of that are as of yet outstanding that we've asked for? I think that puts a pretty good
Chris,
wrapper on it.
could you, for the developers who would like to cooperate, maybe you could ask them what they have right now as far as near future permits, are inquired.
Well, just to clarify.
As far as documents, as far as like
a surface use agreement?
Yeah, surface use agreements that's already in place.
Because the permitting would be.
They're going to go that avenue here in a short time.
We were not going to do that I guess, I've been told some of those are proprietary, so.
So let's do this. Let's take that back to council. We need to take that through the city manager's office to see if we can, and if council agrees to allocate staff time accordingly.
I don't want to interrupt except to say some developer sent a memorandum or outline of what their surface use agreement provided, and it's in the notes that we've got, and I can't remember who it was. It was fairly general, but there's something in here about
Shay.
We received that. The committee, everybody in the committee received that document.
But that actually only covers a portion of the reunion development, right? And I will say, Councilman Douglas, what we can find easily that's not proprietary so far through zoning research we actually already have. So again, it's for Second Creek Farms, Prairie Farms, and for Settlers Crossing. So we actually have that now. If anyone wants to take a look, there's actually maps that show where the drilling windows are. It's interesting. It's good stuff. But it's not everywhere. And so I've been told that some of those other surface use agreements that reduce those number of drilling windows from 20 per section down to some lower number, some of those are proprietary. So we were not planning on efforting that.
Okay. So we're 20 minutes past. I want to be sensitive to time, but not cut us short. So we're slated to meet next week with the full committee. We've got a good draft of actions that align to things that we need solved for in order to further our progress in each of the given areas. We will compile that and get that back to this committee so that we can all make sure that everything's there and represented as we've talked about it tonight. Does that make sense? And then as far as our agenda with industry next week, suggestions on how we want to structure that meeting to make the most of it. Do we do a deep dive on a particular area of concern to try and do some additional information collection? Do we want to go back to the questions that we've received answers to and get follow-ups on that? I would like thoughts on how best to leverage our time with them next week. And Jim?
I think that one of the things that we do after we get names of people who can do this testing is tell Hillcarp, we want to get this testing done and we want you to pay for it because you've assured us that everything is okay here. We're just trying to, prove it to us.
I think that is something that I'm going to go on a limb here. That's something that we need council to suggest a best course on once we take that back to council, right? When I say council, I mean legal council versus city council. We got to take that request back to the city council and say, we want to proceed with this air monitoring baseline. And if council says yes, then we need legal counsel to tell us how we approach that. Is it something that we take to Hillcorp specifically, or we go to COGCC and say, this is the first of the special permit considerations we want you to enact?
Well, I know that COGCC is not going to pay for it.
No, I'm not saying they will.
Might.
I understand. Okay. Does that make sense, though? As far as the progression that we have, I know it's painful, but we've got to go through that process. You and I can't individually go and direct that action. So I guess back to the question on meeting structure for next week.
I'd say, I'd like to ask the industry about the horizontal drilling, because they talk about the technology, how they can do horizontal drilling, come under 2 miles, and we could talk about that to deal with the setback.
Are there, so, because I think some of that exists in the answers that we've gotten back, and I think some of that has come in the initial Anadarko presentation. Are there specifics beyond that? Because what I want to make sure we do to make the best use of our time is if we've got a specific question on that we craft it well.
Mm-hmm.
So I know...
Just to deal with our land use development code, because it says industrial and public zoning.
So my understanding from the discussions here and what we heard at Mr. Benson's community meeting, and what I've been able to scour on COGCC, says from a pad, and so if we talk, or what was the term we're using? If it's a
The window, I don't know
the
if
window,
that's
right? So
technically
if
there.
they've got a window on a square mile,
Right, they explained that. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that, as far as agenda and, part of the memorandum of understanding, because they talk heavily about horizontal drilling, but they consider a further setback because based on the technology. They're here, why not make that a topic? Because they need to explain if that is a proven technology, why can't it be set back based on their, what they want to find?
right?
If they have the mineral rights where they're going, horizontally, vertically, or whatever, what would you propose that we do to stop them from exercising their mineral rights?
They have technology. The setback should be sufficient enough where they can go down from
You're saying that the
setback
primary well should be set back.
Right.
Right, and we've got those rules in effect, and what we're going to try to work out with our MOU is perhaps a longer setback. But as far as horizontally, they can't go underneath your property unless they have the mineral rights. If they do have the mineral rights, they're going to be able to do it.
So I think...
No, I'm talking about...
Well, but you're talking about horizontal drilling.
Okay, so I think and I understood your request on the increased setbacks item in that regard, right? So we want to define what the setback from an established property should be,
right,
with the assumption that they're going to horizontally
because
access those minerals under the ground.
They have an adjoining property or lease on another set of land where they can drill on.
They don't have to be right on top of. They can do it from some distance back. Yep, I'm with you. So I think we'll list that. It becomes one of the things that we want to put on the table, as I understand it, for requesting of industry through an MOU or in our LDC if it's supportable, right? Okay.
You don't know unless you ask.
Absolutely. Jody, any suggestions for what you want to attack on the next meeting?
I personally don't have any suggestions because I need these as a starting point.
Okay.
So I don't have any. I'm looking at what you proposed here, and we've got well sitting and permitting, we've got well drilling completion, recompletion February 8th, fracture, stimulation, flowback, well cleanup, and then that's air, water, noise. So I'm trying to figure something out, but I can't. I really think that we need to. That's my starting point. So I don't know what we could accomplish next week.
You asked the industry about the air, as far as.
Remember, we've got answers still outstanding because there were questions raised by Mr. Stapleton about air and water. Those are actually out to both Tri-County and to
I just meant as far as
CDPHE.
Well, maybe we could do that. We could do second and third level questions, and I know that we have some citizens that haven't had their questions answered. So.
Yeah, I guess the objective was last week was obviously to try and go through the questions that we received answers to and identify where there was more information needed.
Okay, so again, because we don't have everybody who we usually rely on here, can we, the air and water analysis next week, Bill? Ashley? For next week? Our suggestion.
So I want to be.
So could we do the water analysis next week? Wouldn't we have an expert that we could bring?
I'm going to put that down,
okay.
But I want to try and figure out how we deliver on what council asked us for, right? Which is we've got to come back with a recommendation. And at this point, we need to do our very best to come away with at least the framework of a recommendation out of the meeting next week so that it can go to council the following, because we don't have a meeting the following Monday, it's the Monday after. And if we want to try and broker an additional voluntary moratorium, we've got to try and get that discussion going as well. So how do we time the two of those? Would it make...
That'll be our next agenda, just to ask for more time.
Well, maybe that's what we should do, yeah, on that last meeting of the month is...
Bring in those experts.
The water.
And start on that there, because that would take forward a deeper dive.
So as a setup for next week, assemble these pieces, would it make sense to have staff try and help us structure that straw man, if you will, the rough draft, if you will, of the pieces that we want to put forward to council at the high level that they are, and start to facilitate some discussion with industry around those points to get a sense at least of where there might be an opportunity for dialogue or not, right? They're not going to budge here at all. Looks like they have some interest here, because we've heard even in our earliest meetings, for example, notification, which we had such frustrations with the well near South Lawn, they were suggesting they are open to notification well in advance of even when we would be notified through the designee process. So if we start to put some of those things down and start to talk it through in that regard, that may give us the sense of, hey, council, we're at an impasse because none of the things that we want are even remotely of interest to industry. Or, you know what, we've got some interested areas here. Maybe we want to have staff and our legal counsel go off with industry and start to try and take that further to bring us something back. Does that make sense? As a way to try and get a stake in the ground next week and then come behind it with the more detailed discussions on air, water, arsenal?
Well, since we have, industry next week, maybe we should, do this here with the concerns of the citizens and, what those concerns are, and approach it that way to them. And, where our regulations can sit as far as a city.
Does that make sense to staff and council as far as the ability to start to put at least a straw man based on these inputs together to help guide that discussion?
I think industry would like to have that discussion. I think I've been told that they would like to hear what we want.
To start that dialogue.
To start that dialogue.
I want to get to a spearhead.
Okay.
Even if we don't build the whole spear, just the tip of it, so we can start proceeding forward, because as far we know what citizens want. They want good air quality, good water quality, and health and safety. What are we going to do to start providing that? And I don't want to start backtracking over the same issues that we've gone over before. Let's keep moving forward and see how we can produce good air quality baseline monitoring and water quality baseline monitoring. Let's see how we can do the ultimate in protection for our citizens without having to go back and somebody else tell me about an air study that I already know about, and it's going to be disputed by 2 or 3 different parties.
So how about this? The question to you gentlemen would be this. Based on what you've heard tonight, based on the work that you've been doing in the background, do you feel like there's something that you can put together that could make it out to this committee in advance of next week for at least rough input that we could use to frame discussion next Thursday?
In regards to potential code recommendations?
I think initially it would be MOU considerations followed by code considerations, right? Is that a logical order? It's like put on the table what we can get industry to agree to, and then you supplement that with areas that we believe we can enforce within our local code. I mean, you want, again, back to that whole, we got county, we got city. We want to cover all those things inside of our growth boundary.
What if we are just throwing a suggestion out, and to address Councilman Bullock's point, actually almost everyone's point, we could provide a matrix showing what categories just categorically, right? Not saying it's good or bad or anything, just what categories our current code addresses, and then compare that to some other jurisdictions and possibly the COGCC, I think, and what they cover under the same categories. So if we had noise, does our code cover noise?
Right.
Odor.
Traffic.
Traffic, right, all these things. We could put together a matrix showing what does our code cover currently, not necessarily a suggestion about what it should do, just what does it do today, so that the committee could start to look at that and say, okay, all right, nobody else does that, do we want to do that, all right? Everybody does that and we don't. Well, we really want to zero in on that. Start working on that.
Yep.
And, okay, nobody tackles that. That's clearly under the state's jurisdiction. Don't worry about that. It may just be the starting point for the spear point, I think is what you called it.
It's that worksheet concept we've talked about, which I think to me would be a great way to sit down. Does that make sense?
I don't know what makes sense right now because we're in between all this stuff and it's, I mean,
You're talking about making progress, and that it's kind of a city function to go back to the council for progress. I mean, our function is gather information, to feed it to this council and to you guys, and we're still working on that. So if we can continue that part next week, we'd like to see the report, but it's not part of our function.
well, that would be nice to have that information, but I think that, what a good starting point for us next week would be to have Wes and Phil. And again, I like to, in terms of the dialogue too, I mean, it's crazy that we have to be sitting here like mouthing. I mean, we can't respond really, so it would be nice to have either Phil or Wes with us as well, because, number one is we want to get that information so that they can put it together.
Just to be clear, I heard you loud and clear.
Right.
But when we left last week, there was a consensus on the makeup of this meeting. So
right.
I hear you. I appreciate it. It's noted, and we're going to act on it.
Okay, great. So number one, the water. We want to have talk about the water next week with our experts, Phil and Wes. Number two, just to reiterate what we need in terms of that information, we just need the worst case scenario so that we can see how much water, how much sand, the worst case scenario in terms of that for the report and the
So I hear it, but I also hear conflict in what we're talking about around the table. We've said we need to make progress. We want to show progress. I want to just play this out for a second. If we get an air and water report next week, and I'm willing to bring gentlemen just to sort this out, come up here for 1 second. There's a microphone right here on the corner. In the spirit of taking, and again, this is sort of conceptually what staff's trying to build, right? This is every area of concern, including things like this: air, water, geologic hazards, soil sampling, spills and releases. These are all the things that staff has, some of which are covered in our land development code today, some of which are not, that other cities cover or the COGCC covers. And then you've got all these other municipalities across the top. If we have staff continue this so that we can see where we're exposed, where we're not, what we cover, what we don't, I'm trying to understand if we want to talk about air and water and the fact that we want to do monitoring, what further would the report help inform us on, other than the degree to which perhaps we might want to do that? And to give, I guess, an initial framework, is that something that we would want to come behind it with? If we all agree that we want to do air and water monitoring, then we come back and say, okay, let's look more deeply at the subject of air and water monitoring, and how might we approach that? Does that make sense? So with that said,
Let me try it.
Yeah.
Turn it
Thanks. Well, with respect to air monitoring, the science is showing that hazardous air pollutants from fracking is a substantial health risk, but it's not regulated or monitored by the state. An odor criteria will not be sufficient to understand hazardous air pollutants. So what we thought we would do was to offer this committee some experts in that from the National Oceanographic Atmospheric Administration, where they've been testing for that in Erie, Colorado. And so we want, in order to do that effectively, you would first do this full build-out. Because the community's not talking about just looking at one well at a time.
Absolutely.
So, and we would do the build-out roughly what he said, not what each company's doing, but just because the entire community is ripe for Niobrara oil development.
Right.
But really, it was bringing in an expert better than me or Phil with respect to this air pollution and public health risk. It is not, you heard me, I mean, it's not regulated by the state.
Which, based on everything we've heard, if it's not regulated by the state, the potential exists for us potentially to regulate that. To some degree.
Correct. And that's why I thought maybe in the sequence, we would get at this legal restrictions with respect to preemption and to total ban prior to that. So we could also broaden that discussion.
What I'd like to maybe suggest, because I want to make the most of the time that we're all here together, and we can't solve everything in the room, and we've got to figure out ways to break this down, and I know you guys get that. So part of, I think, what Chris was suggesting, if we kind of head down this path, and just to throw this in front of you to help frame it, if we have a discussion on, again, those elements in general to mid-level terms, right? To say, we can do something about it, we can't. We have recommendations in those regards that we want to put forward to council. To me, that's the first piece of it, right? And then it's a matter of saying, okay, given the intensity, when we talk about air and water monitoring, you want to go to this extent, right? To come, not you want to say upfront, we want to recommend that council implement or explore implementing those monitoring and controls, right? The extent to which and how you do that is a subsequent discussion, is it not? To say, you're going to do it this, we want you to recommend doing it this way, at this intensity, at these points. Is that it? I mean, that's my layman's take on it. Is that a fair way to read it, or not at all?
I mean, I worked in planning for much of my federal career. That isn't the way we would do it. I mean, what we would do is exactly what Wes said. We would start with our worst case scenario, because that gives you the maximum impacts. That's what you're really facing if the oil and gas industry decided that they wanted to put 16 wells per section in the city of Commerce City, and they could do it.
So let me ask it a different way.
Okay. So that's what you would, let me just say, so that's what you'd try to examine, is if they did that, if they put 16 per section, and each one was a horizontal, and each went out a mile or something like that, you'd be looking at 5 million gallons per frac. And you could get your cumulative water demand, you could get your cumulative sand demand, you could get your cumulative poison demand, you could get the impact on your roads, and that's something that you all need, that people need, and the city, and it's a starting point. And then you start making decisions, where do we go from here? Because once you have the wells, or at least the maximum wells, you have a way of measuring the impacts on air, if we know what the impacts on air are from other places.
Right.
So it's just a rational way of building a plan.
I like it, I'm logical, and I get it, and I like it.
Yeah.
I guess the point is, you won't have that to the full extent next Wednesday, is my guess.
We'll have enough to start, absolutely.
So what I'd like to maybe have happen, I would suggest, is with council members' agreement, we ask staff to work with Wes and Phil, potentially offline, to help look at how we merge your model to that model and figure out a way to tell a story.
We'd be glad to do that.
In order to structure the discussion that we're starting to talk about. Does that make sense?
I think that this trying to get these guys to find all the leases is a moving target.
Well, and we're not going to find all the leases. We already
Wouldn't
agreed
even
to that.
bother. I mean, it's wasted money.
Yep.
I mean, the whole area is underlain by Niobrara.
That's right.
So you're wasting your time. We do know what Hillcorp has, and we've examined it, and we can tell you what the requirements, and it's pretty startling. And that's just 4.2 sections.
So if in order to kind of hit both points, Phil, do you think it would make sense for you and planning and Phil and Wes to try and mesh that thing with some of those planning factors, so that when we're going down this list and we hit the point on air, we've got tied to that the perspective that they're bringing in? We can talk about it in that context? Sure. Would that work?
Can I
think
make
that
a,
would be.
Can I make a comment real quick?
Yep.
You mentioned that when you did the planning process, you start with a worst-case scenario.
Yeah. Well, it's one of the scenarios you do.
Sure. But that's within an existing planning and regulatory framework.
Mhm.
And the problem is, we don't have a good planning and regulatory framework, and we're trying to figure out how to adjust it. From the staff perspective, we're trying to help this committee get to where it needs to go. But in my view, we're arguing about the color of the door hinges when we don't have a foundation poured yet. We just don't have a product to start with. And if you can help us get a product to start with, we can help you get where you need to go.
To get that foundation.
Yeah. Normally your mitigation is done after you understand your plan. I mean, like I said the last time, it's hard to put a speed limit on a road unless you know what the road looks like. And in this case, it's hard to write rules and regulations that would protect the people of the city without knowing what
I would argue
road-
in this case that you're trying to figure out the speed limit of a road that hasn't been built yet.
Right.
And we can't, until the road's built, we can't give you the numbers of traffic counts and lane width and everything else and visibilities to figure out what the speed limit is.
But I think we made good consensus earlier to say we can plan based on what we know about state regs, et cetera, what a worst case could be, just for argument's sake. And you have
happen, but it's the worst case.
Right, and you have. It sounds like you have some data on a legitimate nearby scenario with Erie that we could use to help add some additional color to that analysis. Is that a fair interpretation? So rather than continue to swirl, let's start to no, we're making good progress, but I think we can continue that progress. Maybe a better way to say it is to continue this momentum, the constructive momentum, and let people go home that have been here all day.
Well, let me just add two things.
I want to just get a quick consensus.
Okay. I think if we get this worst case scenario and get the water demand, then the USGS has built a model that they're using in California at Menlo Park that will actually measure in the seismic activity that might be expected from this sort of injection. And it's public property, and I happen to know some people in USGS fairly high up, and I think we could get them here, maybe somebody out of the USGS in this office that understands their program, and look at what we're proposing, and so you can get some idea what the seismic risk is. And the same would be true of air. If we know how many wells at the maximum they're going to put in over a 20-year period, you can start getting a pretty good idea of what your area impacts are, and then you can start mitigating for them.
So I'm going to ask for this. Okay. You have a mental plan of these data points that you want to be able to assemble. Can you do us a favor? Let's drop that to mail, put that on an email back to the distro. You're all on that distro. And separately, if I can ask staff and Mr. Barber to coordinate with you to see what you guys are able to align on between now and next week reasonably, even if it's in draft fashion, to get to determine together what of all that conceivably could be in hand next week to help guide discussion when we have industry present, and determine also what's going to take longer and therefore need to happen in a subsequent meeting. Because I think if we can get a sense of that, and we can get counsel on Monday, Renee, this is to you, and Steve to you. Renee, if we can get you and Steve on Monday, in my absence, to explain this to council so that we can get staff cleared to go off and do this.
We also have,
I understand.
And we have jails
but
that can help with that.
They can help reinforce, but you as the committee member or you as a committee member. The key is figure out what's viable for a tool to guide discussion next week so that when we sit down with industry, we can start going down this list to get a sense of where we've got opportunity or not. Does that make sense?
Well, it's pretty easy to figure out the potential number of wells. I mean, that's not going to take very long. So if that's the worst case scenario, we could probably do that in a half an hour.
Okay.
And then, I frankly think that this matrix from just looking at it pretty quickly, hits the high points.
Okay.
And
Yeah, Chris, do we have the basic draft that we can pass?
This is in draft form. We were literally putting this together
You
this
guys have been
afternoon. This is not
like crazy.
factually accurate, so please don't. It may be accurate. We were working on this. We just started on this afternoon, so this is a rough draft. That's all I would say.
So think of it as an example of the kind of information
Yes,
that will take shape.
that's
and
a good way of putting it.
It will ultimately get sanitized for from a factual perspective.
Would it be fair to say, Chris, that if there's an X that says Broomfield requires this, Broomfield may not in fact require that?
Okay.
Is that what you're saying?
So I'm sorry, we were distributing.
Is it fair to say if you're looking at the matrix and there's an X that says Broomfield requires this, that may or may not be correct?
No. So when you get the matrix that you're handing around, there's a variety of categories that are listed. If it has an X next to it, it means that jurisdiction's set of codes covers it somehow. It may not be to the degree that we want, it may be more than what we want, but if it has an X, they talk about it. That's all it says. So this is not a normative statement matrix.
Starting point.
It's just saying, do they talk about it or not?
Okay. So we're not going to take any more time on this. This is, again, tonight anyway. Staff's going to continue to evolve this. We're going to do a math exercise for projection's sake. We're going to see if staff can get with Wes and Phil to figure out how the things that they want to be able to help layer into our planning process can be achieved. And we will convene next week to...
One point of clarification, just to make sure that we know what we're expected to do. There was some discussion for a while about, I'm talking next week about what is and what is not preempted.
Yes, and I thought...
So is there an expectation that we come back with that conversation?
I thought that was going to be woven into this. Is there a way to weave that into this?
Maybe, yeah. Let us talk about that. But I guess if you're charging us to do that, we will somehow try and have a conversation about what is and what is not preempted. That will generate a spirited discussion.
It sure will.
Yeah, and again, what we'll want to do is have it there, be mindful of how spirited we get in that discussion to be able to move through that discussion and figure out what we have to come back to in greater depth.
In the spirit of setting expectations, this group is charged with coming back with some recommendations in 2 weeks. So my question is, if you guys are wanting to come up with a series of recommendations about these specific things, not just do we talk about them, but what should they say? That's a lot of heavy lifting. If there is something that is preempted, and I'm going to look at the two of you gentlemen, I am not an expert. I'm not challenging anything you're saying. But let's just say somebody else says that air monitoring is preempted. Right? Shouldn't we have that conversation first before we spend a lot of time measuring metric tons of output of all this other stuff, if that's not going to be part of what's included? Does that make sense?
I said I don't want to go back.
Yeah.
Go forward.
So your rational model, I'm with you. My suggestion is that you have the conversation about what's preempted first. That's just my suggestion.
We agree.
No. See, now I knew it was going to come across like that. I'm not saying anything. Don't just.
But we certainly.
There are areas that are less sticky than others.
Yeah, we think we should have that conversation about preemption and about ultimately a ban with our legal expert providing information to you prior.
I just want to be clear.
Maybe that's next week.
We have a longer term ask for our legal team to come back with an analysis on a total ban. I assume that is not an answer that we're going to get next week or the week after, beyond what we've already heard you say. Is that a fair?
Well, just to manage expectations, I'll tell you today, you cannot totally ban oil and gas drilling in this jurisdiction, period.
So we will.
Period. You cannot do it.
We will lay that aside because it's not solvable immediately. It's not that we won't come back to it. The point is, it's not going to happen immediately. So is that a fair, reasonable expectation to say we need to come back to that, and our recommendation to council can be you need to continue to explore this, but...
We need to continue exploring the pluses not the minuses. And a total plan is strictly a minus right now because it's something that we aren't going, we know we can't consider because of state law, and the council isn't going to lead the city down a road to lawsuit.
Okay, so have staff at least do a cursory discussion with Phil and Wes, is that fair, on
what?
on the air and water considerations given your model, once you have your model?
I guess. Yeah, we're way past staff technical ability to. We are not an environmental staff. Those are usually in counties. So we'll have those conversations. We'll see.
So we'll progress this to the extent we can. You'll determine whether it's here or in a complementary document that will talk about areas of preemption that it at least suggests that we shouldn't spend an inordinate amount of time on that subject in the near term, but at some point. Is that a fair way to say that? And use this framework to start the discussion on what we want to ask for with industry next week.
We can do that.
Great.
I think that it would be natural, Jason, if you're going to have a discussion of wells and water, that you have a discussion of that goes to your matrix on water and probably goes to a matrix on land use, because those are interrelated, and I think you can start making a stab at that. Because it's going to, there are going to be a lot of questions about where they're going to get the water. Do they have the water rights for this? Yep. And they've been robbing a lot of people of water, and I don't think they have one water right in this entire state that I'm aware of. Right. So, I mean, there are a lot of secondary issues, and Phil may be a...
We know where they're getting the water from here.
Well, it may be unlawful, guys.
No, but they're buying it.
But we need and what I would ask, guys...
South Adams County can sell it. But it
Hold
doesn't
on.
mean that they can use it, because they haven't gone into water court.
What I would like, because we have a lot of these comments come up and suggestions, I want them on tape. Can you document them so that we can
Sure,
we can make
we
sure
can
that
ask the questions. Sure.
So that we can make sure that we consider them, right?
Because you're going to be talking about a lot of water, and
yeah.
Commerce City should be concerned about where the hell is all this water going to come from, and where are they going to dispose of
And I
it.
guarantee the comment I've heard from everybody on this council is just that, because water is king here, and we've watched development not happen as a result of water. So we're very, very concerned about that. We have regulations in this city that say you can't build here unless you bring water, and show us where that water is going to come from for a sufficient amount of time. So we're with you on that, and I think, again, we can, in these discussions, say, we need to know about where you're getting your water.
Right.
But how far do you take that discussion, right? To get the discussion going. Does that make sense? Sure. We don't have to solve the whole thing. We need to know there's a concern about water, and we need you to be able to answer it. Is that a...
Sure. I think, you should go down a path that leads to pretty direct progress, and try and keep the things that are
really, really sticky.
Really sticky in reserve, I mean, as much as possible, because I think the answer you come to at the end may be a lot different than the answer you think you've got at the front. I mean, I just know that's the way things are. It's the way things should be.
It's 10 o'clock.
It is 10 o'clock, and we are...
And we're an hour past our time.
I got an hour, it takes me an hour to get
Next
home.
week, we're going to meet at 7, as we did tonight. Staff and Phil and Wes are going to talk. In advance of that, staff is going to continue work on the matrix that they're establishing and also help us get better numbers around planning for total...
Same room, right?
Yeah, we're in the same room next week. I will just say that we are up against teen court next week. The expectation is that they will end, and there will be about a half-hour buffer between their end and our start. So we just ask that folks gather out in the lobby. As soon as teen court clears, staff is going to get the room set up for us, and then we'll be able to come on in. So we're clear. We're going to use the next iteration of this document along with the planning projections that staff's able to come up with, and we'll have staff, Phil and Wes, start to talk about how to layer in their areas of concern and suggestion on analysis that needs to occur to help further inform our decision making. Is that a fair way to summarize it? And we'll have that discussion with industry and replan from there.
joyous.
Thank you, everybody. I appreciate all the discussion tonight.